They took his career, they took his reputation, and when he dared to rise from nothing, they sent their lawyers to take whatever was left. Grayson Hale was nobody's hero. He was just a broke single father with grease under his fingernails and a little girl who needed dinner on the table. But sometimes, the man the world throws away is the most dangerous one in the room, because he has absolutely nothing left to lose. This is his story. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The pink slip came on a Tuesday, not a Friday the way they usually did it, when HR departments across America had collectively decided that ruining someone's life was slightly more humane when followed immediately by a weekend. No. Grayson Hale's termination came on a Tuesday morning in early November, slid across a glass conference table by a human resources manager named Dennis, who couldn't maintain eye contact for more than 3 seconds at a stretch. Dennis had soft hands. Grayson noticed that. The kind of hands that had never rebuilt a transmission or diagnosed a seized engine at 2 a.m. in a freezing parking lot. Dennis's hands had probably never done anything more strenuous than opening a car door. "The company appreciates your years of service," Dennis said, staring somewhere past Grayson's left shoulder. "Given the restructuring, your position has been eliminated. We've prepared a severance package." "Who made this call?" Grayson asked. The question came out quieter than he intended. Not aggressive, just flat, like a man who already knew the answer and was giving Dennis one last chance to be honest. Dennis cleared his throat, shuffled a paper. "These decisions come from senior leadership." "Dennis," Grayson leaned forward slightly. "I've been with Meridian Automotive for 6 years. I've rebuilt their entire diagnostic division from a department that was losing money into something that generates patents. I need you to look me in the eyes and tell me who signed off on this." Dennis finally looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. "Miss Sinclair oversees all structural decisions at the divisional level," he said carefully. "That's all I'm able to share." Grayson sat back in his chair. Aurora Sinclair, 30 years old. Walked into Meridian 14 months ago as the new Vice President of Strategic Development, a title that everyone in the engineering wing privately agreed had been invented specifically for her. The daughter of a man who sat on 2 automotive industry boards. Beautiful in the way that powerful people sometimes were. Not soft, not approachable, but sharp, like something designed to cut. She had reorganized 3 departments in her first 6 months. Grayson had watched colleagues disappear one by one, their years of experience replaced by younger faces with MBA degrees and no grease on their hands. He told himself he was different. His work spoke for itself. The diagnostic methodology he'd spent 4 years developing had saved Meridian millions in warranty costs alone. He told himself that mattered. He stood up. Didn't take the severance folder. "Tell Miss Sinclair I said good luck," he said, and walked out. He sat in his truck in the parking garage for 40 minutes before he could bring himself to start the engine. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it, a cracked dashboard that he'd never gotten around to replacing, and a child's drawing taped to the glove compartment. A purple house with what appeared to be either a dog or a very round horse standing in front of it. His daughter Lily had made it for him 2 years ago when she was 5. She'd explained very seriously that the animal was a wolf because wolves were protective. Grayson stared at that drawing for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his mother. "They let me go," he said when she answered. A pause. His mother, Carol Hale, was 61 years old and had worked as a school cafeteria manager for 23 years. She understood immediately that this was not a moment for advice or silver linings. "Come over for dinner," she said. "I'll make the pot roast." "Mom, it's 11 in the morning." "Then I'll start it now and it'll be ready by the time you figure out what to do with the rest of your day." He almost laughed. Almost. "I need to pick up Lily at 3. "I know when you pick up Lily, come over." He drove to his mother's house instead of his apartment, sat at her kitchen table while she moved around the stove and told her everything. The meeting, Dennis and his soft hands, Aurora Sinclair's name spoken like a corporate verdict. Carol listened without interrupting, which was not her natural state. That restraint, more than anything, told Grayson she understood how bad it was. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. Grayson wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth helped somehow. "I don't know yet." You have the severance? I didn't take it. Carol turned to look at him. Grayson Michael Hale. If I take it, I sign a non-disclosure. I'm not signing anything that stops me from... He stopped himself. From what? He didn't even know yet. I need options open. She studied him the way she had when he was 16 and had done something she considered either very smart or very stupid and hadn't yet decided which. How much is in savings? About $2,000. She turned back to the stove, said nothing for a moment. That's not nothing. Mom, $2,000 is almost nothing. Almost, she repeated firmly, like the word mattered. Almost nothing is still something. He told Lily that evening, or rather he told her as much as a 7-year-old needed to understand. They were sitting on the floor of their apartment living room, Lily eating cereal for dinner because Grayson had forgotten to go grocery shopping and because she considered cereal an acceptable meal at any hour, which was one of the many ways she was easier to parent than he deserved. Daddy doesn't have his job anymore, he said. Lily looked up from her bowl. She had her mother's eyes, a very specific shade of brown that was almost amber in certain light, and that could express complicated emotions with a precision that sometimes made Grayson's chest hurt. Did you get fired? My position was eliminated, which is a fancy way of saying yes. She considered this. Are we going to lose our house? We don't own a house, Bug. We rent an apartment. Are we going to lose our apartment? No. We're going to be okay. He believed this as he said it and didn't believe it simultaneously. I'm going to figure something out. Lily studied him with an expression that was uncomfortably perceptive for a second grader. You should fix cars, she said. You're really good at fixing cars. Grayson looked at his daughter. What makes you say that? Because whenever our car makes a noise, you already know what's wrong before you even look at it. And Mrs. Patterson said her son took his car to the dealer and they charged him $800 and it still wasn't fixed. You could fix it. He blinked. You talked to Mrs. Patterson about car repair? She brings it up a lot, Lily said, returning to her cereal. She's very upset about it. Grayson sat there on the living room floor and felt something shift in the back of his mind. It was small, barely a movement, like the first indication of a gear catching. He'd been fixing engines since he was 14 years old, learning from his uncle in a backyard garage in Dearborn, Michigan. He'd gone to school for mechanical engineering because it was the closest formal education to what he already loved doing. He'd taken the corporate job because it paid well, and because Sarah had been pregnant with Lily, and the world had suddenly required him to be practical. But the corporate job had always felt like wearing someone else's coat. He thought about that for a long time after Lily went to sleep. He found the garage 3 weeks later. It was on the east side of Detroit, on a block that had seen better decades. A 2-bay commercial building sandwiched between a shuttered laundromat and a vacant lot where someone had deposited an impressive collection of old tires. The building itself was concrete block construction, built sometime in the late 1960s by the look of it, and it showed its age in every possible way. The roof had a section over the rear bay that had partially collapsed at some point and been repaired with materials that were clearly wrong for the job. One of the bay doors was warped enough that it wouldn't close all the way. The electrical panel was a fire inspector's nightmare. The man selling it was named Roy Dempsey, 73. He'd run an auto body shop there for 31 years until his knees gave out and his son moved to Phoenix. He wanted $2,000 for the building's lease transfer and whatever equipment was left inside, which consisted of a floor jack that needed new hydraulic fluid, a compressor that worked intermittently, a parts washer of uncertain vintage, and a hydraulic lift that Grayson spent 40 minutes inspecting before deciding it was structurally sound, even if everything else about it suggested neglect. She's got good bones, Roy said, watching Grayson examine the lift. She's got some bones, Grayson said. I wouldn't call all of them good. Roy laughed. It turned into a cough. You know engines? Yeah. What kind of work you looking to do? Diagnostic and repair. No body work, no paint, mechanical. Grayson looked around the space. High ceilings. That was something. Good clearance for working on trucks. The floor was cracked concrete, but it was level. Natural light came through 2 grimy skylights that would be a significant improvement once cleaned. How long's it been empty? 8 months. Had a kid in here for a while trying to flip motorcycles. Didn't last. Why didn't it last? Roy shrugged. Because wanting to work on motorcycles and knowing how to work on motorcycles are two different things. He had more of the first kind. Grayson looked at the warped bay door, looked at the roof, calculated in his head what it would take to get the space functional, not perfect, functional, on the thinnest possible budget, using as much labor as he could provide himself. "I'll give you 1,800, he said. Roy looked at him steadily. "I said 2,000. "You did. And the compressor runs about 60% of the time, one bay door won't close, and there's a section of roof over the rear that's going to need attention before the first serious rain. 1,800, and I take all of it as is." Roy was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was actually considering it rather than performing consideration. 2,000, he said, "but I'll leave you the tool chest in the back. There's a good set of combination wrenches in there, still got the original Craftsman warranty on them." Grayson thought about his bank account, thought about Lily's cereal dinner, thought about his mother's voice saying almost nothing is still something. "Deal," he said, and they shook hands. He drove back to his apartment and transferred the $2,000 and sat in his car for a while after pulling into the parking lot, staring at the building across the street without really seeing it. His account had $63 and a handful of change in it. He had a 7-year-old daughter, an unemployment claim he'd filed that would take weeks to process, and a leaking garage in one of the tougher parts of Detroit. What he did not have was anything resembling a safety net. He went inside and made Lily a real dinner. Pasta. Not from a box. He stood at the stove and cooked, and told himself that this was the part of the story where it either turned into something or it didn't. And the difference between those two outcomes was almost entirely about what he did next. He started with the bay door. It took him 2 full days of work, disassembling the track system, identifying where the frame had warped, shimming and rehanging with components he sourced from a demolition salvage yard for $38. When the door finally closed flush and the lock seated properly, he stood back and looked at it for a moment with the particular satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem using nothing but patience and applied knowledge. Then he started on the compressor. The electrical panel took a week and cost him $340 in parts, money he borrowed from his mother with the kind of discomfort that he knew was going to live in his chest for a while. Carol didn't mention it again after writing the check, which was its own form of generosity. The roof was a problem he couldn't fully solve with money he didn't have. So he solved it the way people in tight circumstances often do, partially and strategically. He patched the worst section himself using materials he found at a Habitat for Humanity restore location and positioned a drainage channel to route water away from the primary work area. It wasn't right. It was good enough. He cleaned the skylights. The difference in natural light was significant, almost startling. The garage transformed from a dim, slightly threatening space into something that at least resembled a place where serious work could be done. He bought a used laptop and built a basic website. Spent 4 hours on it. The website was not beautiful. It had his name, his phone number, his general location, and a brief description of the services he offered. He posted it to 3 local Facebook groups. He taped a handwritten sign to the bay door. Then he waited. The first customer came on a Thursday, 11 days after he'd opened. A woman named Patricia Marsh, 54 years old, drove a 2016 Chevrolet Equinox that had been making what she described as a grinding sort of thump-thump on left turns, but not right turns. 3 different mechanics had looked at it. 2 had told her it needed a new wheel bearing. 1 had told her it needed a new CV axle. She'd paid $600 to have the wheel bearing replaced, and the noise was still there. Grayson put the car on the lift. He had the noise identified in 11 minutes. A cracked steering knuckle with stress fractures that were only loading under specific lateral force conditions, which was why it only expressed on left turns. It was something that required hands-on assessment to diagnose properly. The kind of thing that could be missed on a quick inspection by someone moving too fast. He took Patricia out to the lift and showed her exactly what he was seeing, pointing to the fracture pattern with a flashlight, explaining in plain language what was happening mechanically and why it only manifested under left-turn loads. Patricia stared at it. The other mechanic said it was the wheel bearing. The wheel bearing was also worn, which probably masked the real issue on a quick test drive. They weren't wrong exactly, they just didn't look deep enough. How much to fix it? He quoted her a number that was roughly 40% below what the dealership would have charged. She looked at him with an expression that he would later come to recognize as the standard response of someone who had been routinely overcharged for automotive work and couldn't quite believe the alternative existed. "Why is it that cheap?" she asked, not accusatory, just confused. "Because I don't have a waiting room with a coffee machine and a service advisor on commission," he said. "It's just me and the work." She left the car. He fixed it properly. When she came back and drove around the block and the noise was gone, she sat in her car for a moment in his parking lot, then came back inside. "My husband drives a delivery truck," she said. "He's been having an issue with it for months. Can I give him your number?" "Yes," Grayson said. "Please." Patricia's husband was named Donald Marsh, and he drove a 2014 Ram 2500 that had been dropped off at 2 different diesel shops with no successful resolution. Donald was a compact, serious man who had the look of someone who had learned to be skeptical of people who claimed to be able to fix things. He drove the truck into the bay, stood with his arms crossed, watched Grayson do his assessment. Grayson didn't perform for him, didn't explain everything he was doing or make a show of the process. He just worked, methodically, thoroughly, the way he always did. He hooked up his diagnostic equipment. He listened to the engine with the focused attention that was either a skill or a compulsion. He'd never been sure which. He asked Donald 3 specific questions about when the issue occurred and what conditions seemed to affect it. 40 minutes later, he had a diagnosis. "Your injection timing is off on cylinder 4, and you've got a small crack in the return line that's causing intermittent fuel pressure drops. The 2 issues together are creating a symptom pattern that probably reads like a bigger problem than it is." Donald uncrossed his arms. "How long to fix?" "Day and a half if the line fitting I need is at the local supplier. 2.5 if I have to order it. The shop downtown had it for 3 weeks and told me they needed to rebuild the injection pump." "They might have gotten there eventually if they kept guessing," Grayson said, without particular judgment in his voice. "But no, you don't need a pump rebuild." Donald looked at him for a long moment. "Patricia says you're honest." "I try to be. It's easier than the alternative." Something shifted in Donald Marsh's expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the particular regard a practical man develops for another practical man who speaks plainly. "My brother-in-law has a landscaping company. He's got 4 trucks. I'm going to give him your number." "I'd appreciate that." 4 trucks became 6. 6 became 10. Donald's brother-in-law, a man named Carlton, who ran a tight operation and tolerated 0 mechanical downtime, referred Grayson to a small construction firm. The construction firm's owner mentioned him at a diesel owners meetup. A classic car restoration enthusiast brought in a 1967 Mustang with an electrical issue that 4 other shops had misdiagnosed, and Grayson traced the fault to a grounding problem in a wire harness that had been incorrectly repaired at some point in the car's past. He fixed it in 6 hours. The Mustang owner put a post in an online classic car forum that Grayson didn't know existed until someone called to tell him about it. The post had 63 responses within 48 hours. He was working 7 days a week by month 4. He'd hired 1 person, a 19-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had grown up 3 blocks from the garage and had spent 2 years working at an oil change chain before Grayson noticed him doing a brake job on someone's car in the adjacent vacant lot using tools he'd borrowed and a YouTube tutorial he'd memorized. Grayson had watched him for 20 minutes from his bay door before walking over. "You're doing the caliper bracket wrong," he said. Marcus looked up. "I know. I watched 3 videos and none of them account for the fact that this particular year model has a non-standard bracket offset." He said this without defensiveness. Just information. Grayson blinked. "How do you know about the bracket offset?" "Because the first time I did one of these, I torqued it standard spec and it wasn't right, so I looked into it." "What did you find?" 2009 to 2011 on this chassis, the offset is 2 millimeters different from what the service manual says. There's a service bulletin about it that nobody seems to know exists. Grayson was quiet for a moment. "Do you want a job?" Marcus looked at the garage, looked at Grayson. "What does it pay?" "More than the oil change place, less than it will in 6 months if you work out." "That's not a real number." "No, it's not." Grayson shrugged. 14 an hour to start. I'm honest about what I can pay and I don't play games. The work is real, and if you can do it, you'll learn more here than anywhere else in the city. Marcus considered this with the seriousness of someone who couldn't afford to make a bad decision. Can I finish this brake job first? Yes. Do it right. I know how to do it right. That's what I was working toward before you interrupted me. Grayson almost smiled. Be there Monday at 7. Marcus was there at 6:45. He turned out to be exceptional. Not just competent, but genuinely interested, the kind of person who asked questions that revealed he'd been thinking about the problem overnight. He was also bluntly honest, which Grayson valued above almost everything else in a shop environment where a misdiagnosis cost real people real money. They developed a working rhythm that required minimal communication. Grayson would assess a vehicle and give Marcus the diagnosis and the repair approach, and Marcus would execute it with the focused attention of someone trying to master a craft rather than simply complete a task. When Marcus disagreed with an approach, he said so directly and explained why. And occasionally he was right, which Grayson acknowledged without drama. You ever think about going to school for this? Grayson asked him one evening while they were cleaning the shop after close. Marcus thought about it. Maybe eventually. Right now I'm learning more here than I would in class. That'll change. Theory matters. Did it matter for you? Grayson considered this honestly. It gave me a framework to hang experience on. The experience is what does the actual work. You need both eventually. Marcus swept, said nothing for a moment. My mom thinks I should be doing something else. Office job, something with a future, she says. This has a future. That's what I told her. He didn't sound uncertain about it, just noting the disagreement as a fact. She's not convinced yet. Convince her with your paycheck. Marcus glanced up. You planning on raising my pay? I said what I said. The business grew in the irregular, uneven way that small businesses actually grow. Not in a clean upward line, but in lurches and plateaus, with weeks of momentum followed by a slow stretch that made Grayson calculate his margins at the kitchen table at midnight while Lily slept in the next room. He thought about her constantly, the way single parents think about their children, not as a distraction from work, but as a presence woven into every decision. Every dollar he chose to reinvest rather than take out of the business was a calculation that involved Lily. Every time he stayed late in the shop instead of leaving at 5 was a calculation that involved Lily. He tried to maintain a hard boundary around school pickup and dinner and bedtime, the 3 fixed points in the day that he protected with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. He wasn't always successful. There was a period in month 6 when a major client, a regional trucking company that had brought him 3 vehicles, threatened to pull all their business because a job had run 4 days over schedule when a critical part was back-ordered. Grayson had spent 2 evenings on the phone managing the relationship, explaining the supply chain issue, offering a discount on the overrun time. Both evenings he'd been on the phone past Lily's bedtime. On the second night, he'd come out of the kitchen to find her sitting on the couch in her pajamas. Not asleep, just sitting. You're supposed to be in bed, he said. I was waiting to say goodnight. He sat next to her. She leaned against him without comment, the comfortable lean of a child who is tired and trusts the person next to them completely. I'm sorry I was on the phone so long, he said. Is the business okay? He looked at her sideways. Yeah, it's okay. Good, she yawned. I don't want you to have to stop fixing cars. He tucked her in, stood in her doorway for a moment after she'd closed her eyes, the way parents do, looking at the shape of a sleeping child and feeling the full weight of what you are responsible for. Then he went back to the kitchen and finished the logistics problem he'd been working on, because the business being okay required it to actually be okay, and that required sustained effort at all hours. And that was simply the truth of what he'd chosen to do. 14 months in, the name Hale Automotive had outgrown the space. Grayson had hired 2 more mechanics, a veteran named Robert Okafor, who had 20 years of diesel experience and a calm, methodical manner that made him excellent with commercial fleet work, and a woman named Sasha Kim who had trained in South Korea and brought a precision to electrical system diagnostics that Grayson found genuinely impressive. He was paying Marcus $16 an hour, and the promise of more had become concrete and credible. He was also sleeping 4 to 6 hours a night and had developed a persistent tension in his right shoulder from a combination of physical work and the particular stress of running a small business that nobody who hasn't done it can quite understand. The stress was not the dramatic kind, not fear exactly, but a low-grade, continuous awareness of all the things that could go wrong and required his attention to prevent. He knew the operation's reputation was spreading in ways he couldn't fully track. Customers mentioned having heard about him from people he'd never met. A regional trucking magazine had published a brief item about independent shops that were filling service gaps, and while Hale Automotive hadn't been named directly, the description of a Detroit area shop that was drawing commercial clients away from dealerships had prompted 3 calls from people who figured out who it was. What he couldn't know from where he stood, was that the same reputation was being tracked by someone with considerably more resources and considerably more complicated reasons for paying attention. He didn't know that a name had started appearing in conversations he wasn't part of, that in boardrooms and strategy sessions and private communications within one of the largest automotive corporations in the region, someone had started asking questions about a small garage on the east side of Detroit and the methodologies being used there. He didn't know that Aurora Sinclair, 4 years into her rise through Meridian Automotive, had been briefed about his operation. He didn't know what that briefing had contained or what conclusions she had drawn from it. He was in the shop when his phone rang. Robert had a 2018 Freightliner on the lift. Marcus was arguing productively with Sasha about a fuel trim reading that neither of them was satisfied with. The compressor, the original compressor replaced now with a proper unit, ran steadily in the background. Grayson had grease on both hands. He answered the phone without looking at the number. Hale Automotive. Mr. Hale. The voice was professional, measured, with the particular flatness of someone who spoke in legal language by habit. My name is Richard Farrow. I'm with the legal division of Meridian Automotive Corporation. I'm calling to inform you that our client has identified potential intellectual property concerns regarding certain diagnostic methodologies currently being used in your facility. We'd like to schedule a time to discuss. Grayson stood very still. Outside the bay door, a truck rumbled past on the street. Inside, Marcus laughed at something Sasha said. The compressor ran. I'll need that in writing, Grayson said. His voice was completely level. Send everything to this number by text or email. I'll have my attorney review it. He didn't have an attorney. He hung up the phone and stood there for a moment with the grease still on both hands, looking at the garage he had built from $2,000 in 2 years of his life, and felt something he hadn't felt since the morning Dennis had slid that pink slip across a glass table. Not fear. Something older and more complicated than fear. He looked at Lily's drawing, which he'd moved from the truck's glove compartment to the corner of his toolbox over a year ago. The wolf in front of the purple house. Wolves are protective, she'd said. He exhaled slowly. Marcus, he called out, finish the fuel trim diagnostic. I need to make a call. He walked out to the parking lot and stood in the November cold and thought about what he was going to do next. Because whatever Meridian Automotive had just fired at him, it was not the end of anything. He'd been left for nothing before. He knew what to do with that. The letter arrived 3 days after the phone call, which was faster than Grayson had expected. Meridian Automotive's legal division apparently didn't believe in letting things sit. It was 11 pages long. Grayson read it twice at his kitchen table, once quickly and once slowly, the second time with a pen in his hand that he used to underline phrases he didn't fully understand. There were many of them. Legal language operated the way certain engine problems did. The surface presentation was one thing, and what was actually happening underneath required different tools to assess. What he could understand, stripped of the formal phrasing, was this. Meridian Automotive claimed that specific diagnostic methodologies currently being practiced at Hale Automotive bore substantial similarity to proprietary techniques protected under a portfolio of patents that Aurora Sinclair's division had filed and consolidated over the previous 3 years. The letter did not accuse him of direct theft. It was more careful than that. It spoke of potential infringement, of overlapping methodologies, of the corporation's obligation to protect its intellectual property interests. It requested that he cease using the disputed techniques pending a formal review, and it strongly implied that failure to comply would result in legal action. Grayson set the letter down, picked up his coffee. It had gone cold while he was reading. He thought about the diagnostic system he'd developed. It had started taking shape in his head years before Meridian. Ideas about sequential fault isolation that he'd worked out in his uncle's backyard garage when he was barely 20, refining the approach through years of practical application. He'd brought a version of it to Meridian when he joined, documented in a personal notebook that he still had somewhere in his apartment. He'd developed it further during his time there, yes. And then Meridian had taken what he'd helped build and filed it under their own portfolio after he was gone. He understood what had happened now. He understood it with the particular clarity of a man who has been told one story for years and suddenly sees the seams where it was stitched together. He needed a lawyer. The problem was that lawyers who handled intellectual property disputes against major automotive corporations were not the kind of lawyers who cost what Grayson currently had in his account. He knew this before he made a single call, but he made the calls anyway, because not trying was worse than finding out the answer was no. The first two firms he contacted were polite about it. They gave him numbers. He thanked them and hung up. The third firm specialized in small business disputes and was marginally more accessible, but the attorney he spoke to, a tired-sounding man named Callahan, was honest with him in a way that felt like a door closing. Patent litigation against a corporation with Meridian's resources, Callahan said. That's a 2-3-year process minimum. The discovery alone costs money you'd have to be generating at a serious level to sustain. What if I'm right? Grayson asked. What if I can prove the methodology originated with me? A pause. Being right and winning are two different things in IP law. You know that, right? I'm starting to learn it. My advice? Cease using the disputed techniques, document everything, and see if they'll negotiate a licensing arrangement. It's not satisfying, but it keeps you operational. Grayson thanked him and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a while. The apartment was quiet. Lily was at school. Outside the window, Detroit's November gray pressed against the glass. He was not going to stop using the techniques. That much was settled in him before he'd even finished the thought. The techniques were his. He'd developed them. Stopping would mean admitting something that wasn't true. And beyond the principle of it, stopping would mean fundamentally changing how his shop operated, removing the specific capability that had made Hale Automotive what it was. It would be like asking a surgeon to stop using a technique they'd invented because a hospital corporation had filed paperwork claiming ownership of the idea. He opened his laptop and started searching for IP attorneys who worked on contingency for small business cases. It took him 4 days to find Eleanor Voss. She was 58 years old, had spent 12 years at a large firm doing exactly the kind of corporate IP work that Meridian's lawyers did, and had left to start her own practice specifically because she'd grown tired of being on what she referred to in the initial phone call as the wrong side of the table. Tell me your situation, she said. Not warm, not cold, just direct. He told her. All of it. The termination, the garage, the business he'd built, and now the letter. He didn't editorialize. He laid out facts in the order they'd happened and let her assess. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Do you have documentation of your methodology development prior to your employment at Meridian? I have a notebook from 2014, handwritten notes, dated, and I have email records from that period showing me describing the approach to a colleague before Meridian ever filed anything. What about during your employment? Did you produce any internal documents showing the methodology's development trajectory? Probably. I'd need to request those records if they still exist. They'll exist, she said flatly. Corporations don't delete things. They archive everything, which in discovery means it becomes available to both sides. Another pause. Can you come to my office Thursday? Yes. Bring the notebook. Bring whatever email records you can access. Bring the Meridian letter and any subsequent communication. Her voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, but with a different quality to it. Something focused. Mr. Hale, I'm not going to promise you this is easy. Patent litigation is expensive and slow, and the other side has substantially more resources than you do. But if your account is accurate and your documentation is solid, you have a defensible position. And if I can't pay your standard rate? She made a sound that might have been a short laugh. I take a small number of cases on modified arrangements when I believe in them. Let's see your documentation first. He drove to her office Thursday morning. Eleanor Voss operated out of a 2-room suite on the 4th floor of an older office building downtown. Not prestigious, not shabby, just functional. She had the kind of desk that was buried in organized chaos, stacked paper and tabbed folders, and a coffee mug that appeared to be a permanent fixture. She was a small woman with silver hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she read his notebook with the complete attention of someone for whom reading documents was a primary mode of understanding the world. She read for 20 minutes. Grayson sat across from her and didn't fill the silence. "These dates," she said finally, tapping the notebook without looking up. "You're certain of them?" "That's my handwriting. Those are my notes. The dates are real." "The notation style here," she pointed to a specific page. "This is essentially the foundational logic of what Meridian patented in 2021. Yes? And this notebook was in your possession before you ever set foot in their building." "I started at Meridian in March 2016. Those notes are from 2014, some of them earlier." Eleanor took her reading glasses off her forehead and put them on properly, went back to a page, then removed them again. She looked at him over the desk with the expression of someone who has seen a great many situations and is taking the precise measure of this one. "They're going to say you developed this further during your employment, which makes it a work-for-hire situation under the terms of your contract." "I know, but the core methodology was the sequential isolation logic that's in this notebook from 2014. What I developed at Meridian was an expansion. The foundation was mine before they ever paid me $1. That distinction is exactly what we'd need to establish and defend." She set the notebook down. "The email records you mentioned? I have access to a personal email account from that period. I sent notes to myself. Kind of a habit I have, thinking through problems by writing them down." "Timestamps intact?" "Yes." She was quiet again. Grayson had the impression of someone calculating something complex in real time, weighing factors he couldn't fully see. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "Meridian's strategy here is not primarily about the patent. They're not actually afraid you're infringing. You're a small shop in Detroit. What they're doing is using the threat of expensive litigation to make you stop competing in a way that embarrasses them. Their filing is expansive enough to create ambiguity, and ambiguity in IP law functions as a weapon. The cost of fighting it is supposed to be enough to make you fold." "I know," Grayson said. "Most people do fold. It's the rational choice when you're outgunned on resources." "I understand that." She studied him. "But you're not going to." "No." Another silence. She opened a drawer, pulled out a standard engagement letter, and slid it across the desk. "Modified fee arrangement. I take 20% of any settlement or damages awarded if we prevail. If we lose, you cover my direct costs only. Filing fees, expert witness expenses, that category. My hourly work is contingent." Grayson picked up the letter. "Read it carefully." "Why?" "Because I spent 12 years helping corporations do exactly what they're doing to you, and I'm selectively interested in the other direction." She said it without self-congratulation. "Just a fact. Also because your documentation is unusually solid. Most people in your situation don't have dated notebooks from 6 years before the dispute. You do. That matters." He signed the letter. Walking back to his truck afterward in the cold Detroit air with the engagement letter in his inside jacket pocket, he felt something he hadn't felt since the phone call from Richard Farrow's office. Not confidence exactly, something more durable than confidence. A sense of footing, like the ground under him had shifted from uncertain to merely difficult. And difficult was something he knew how to navigate. He called Marcus from the parking lot. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked. He'd picked up on the fact that something was going on, had asked once, and accepted Grayson's vague answer without pressing further. "We're fine," Grayson said. "Is the Freightliner ready?" "Robert finished it an hour ago. Customers picking it up at 4. "Good. I'll be back by 2. Don't let Sasha rewire anything without running it by me first." "I never let Sasha rewire anything without running it by you first. She knows more than me and it makes me nervous." "That's the correct response to someone who knows more than you. You learn from it." He could hear Marcus absorbing this. "That's either wise or annoying. I haven't decided." "Both," Grayson said. "I'll see you at 2. He drove back through the city with the heat running and the radio off, thinking about the notebook in his apartment. All those handwritten pages from 2014, the years before any of this, when he'd been a young mechanic working through problems in a backyard garage because the thinking itself was satisfying. He hadn't known those pages would matter this much. He'd just been working something out. That was usually how the important things happened. Not with intent, just a man, a problem, and enough stubbornness to keep going until it made sense. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, which is to say slowly, with no regard for the pace at which real life operates. Eleanor filed a formal response to Meridian's letter within 2 weeks, asserting prior art and independent development, and attaching a preliminary set of supporting documentation. The response was careful and precise, and it said, in language Eleanor described as professionally assertive, that Hale Automotive would not be ceasing operations or modifying its practices pending any review. Meridian's legal team responded. Eleanor responded to that. It was like watching two chess players conduct an extremely expensive and tedious correspondence game, and Grayson had to trust that Eleanor understood the board better than he did, because most of the moves were not visible to him. What was visible to him was the shop, and the shop required his full attention regardless of what was happening in the legal layer running underneath. Business didn't slow down because of the dispute. If anything, the weeks following Eleanor's engagement were some of the most demanding he'd seen. Carlton's landscaping fleet was transitioning into its off-season maintenance window, which meant a concentrated run of service work. A classic car collector from Birmingham had found him through the forum post from over a year ago and brought in a 1969 Camaro with an engine that had been incorrectly rebuilt by someone who apparently knew enough to be dangerous. Robert handled the fleet work while Grayson focused on the Camaro, which required the kind of extended diagnostic attention he found genuinely engaging when he wasn't also managing 3 employees, a legal dispute, and a 7-year-old science project. The science project was a model of the water cycle. Lily had chosen it herself and was deeply committed to the accuracy of the cloud formations, which she had researched with an intensity that Grayson found both impressive and inconvenient, given that it required 3 separate trips to a craft store for specific materials that she insisted were the only correct materials. "Can't the clouds be cotton balls?" he asked on the second trip. "Cotton balls are too uniform," she said, examining a package of fiber fill with the focused skepticism of a quality control inspector. "Real clouds have irregular edges. This is for a 3rd-grade class presentation. I know. I want it to be right." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old now, wearing a jacket she'd outgrown slightly and carrying the project's seriousness of someone for whom the difference between cotton balls and fiber fill was genuinely significant. She had her mother's precision about her. Sarah had been an architect, someone who understood that details were not incidental to quality, but were in fact what quality consisted of. Lily hadn't known her mother long enough to learn it directly, but she'd gotten it somehow anyway. "Fiber fill it is," he said. She nodded, satisfied. "Thank you." He bought the fiber fill and 2 other materials she deemed necessary, and they drove home through the early dark of a Michigan winter evening, Lily explaining the specifics of the water cycle from the back seat with a thoroughness that suggested she had memorized her source material completely. "Evaporation happens faster when the water is warmer," she informed him. "True. And the clouds aren't actually water, they're water vapor, which is different. Also true. Mrs. Holloway said clouds are made of water droplets, but that's not exactly right. It's more complicated than that. Are you going to correct your teacher?" A brief pause. "I'm going to present accurate information," Lily said carefully, "and let her draw her own conclusions." Grayson found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in what felt like several days. "That's a very diplomatic approach." "I know." She didn't sound smug about it, just accurate. He helped her assemble the project that night after dinner, cutting the baseboard while she directed the placement of each element with focused authority. It took 2 hours. When it was done, they both stood back and looked at it. The uneven, imperfect clouds of fiber fill, the blue-painted ocean, the small arrows indicating evaporation and condensation and precipitation, all of it assembled by a man with grease perpetually under his fingernails and a girl who had decided that cotton balls were insufficient for the task. It was genuinely good, not perfect. One of the mountains was slightly lopsided, and the cloud formation over it was more ambitious than structurally stable, but it was good, and it was hers, and Grayson felt the particular satisfaction of having helped produce something that mattered to someone he loved. "Good work," he said. Lily assessed it a moment longer. "The left cloud needs to be higher." Lily. "Just by about half an inch." "Leave the cloud." She left the cloud, reluctantly. He tucked her in and went back to the kitchen table where Eleanor's latest update was waiting in his email, a 7-paragraph summary of Meridian's formal response to the prior art claim, which was aggressive and well-resourced and exactly what he'd been told to expect. He read it carefully, made notes, and sent Eleanor 3 questions she'd probably already anticipated. Then he sat in the quiet kitchen and did the thing he tried not to do too often, which was let himself think about the full weight of what he was carrying. The legal dispute. The business. Lily. The employees who depended on the shop being operational. The customers who depended on it being trustworthy. All of it running simultaneously. All of it requiring him to be functional and clear-headed and making good decisions at a pace that didn't allow for much margin. He was tired in a way that had become normal. Not depleted. He understood the difference, but persistently tired. The kind that 8 hours of sleep couldn't fully resolve because the 8 hours didn't really happen. He thought briefly about what he would do if he lost. If Eleanor's careful work was not enough. If Meridian's resources overwhelmed his documentation, if the review went the wrong way. He made himself consider it directly, the way he made himself look at the worst possible diagnosis when examining an engine, not because he believed in it, but because knowing what it was allowed him to work against it clearly. If he lost, the shop would have to change its operation substantially. The diagnostic methodology that had made Hale Automotive what it was would be legally off limits. He might be able to rebuild around it, find different approaches, retain the reputation even if the specific techniques were constrained. He'd have to pay Eleanor's direct costs, which were manageable but not trivial. He'd have to explain it to his employees and figure out how to keep them. It was survivable. Difficult and damaging, but survivable. He held that in his mind for a moment. Then he put it aside because he didn't intend to lose, and spending too much time in the losing scenario was a form of energy he couldn't afford. He closed the laptop, washed his coffee mug, went to bed. The next morning he was in the shop by 6:30, an hour before anyone else arrived, doing what he did when he needed to think clearly. Working. He had a 2017 diesel pickup that had come in the previous afternoon, owner complaining of intermittent power loss that presented inconsistently enough to be genuinely puzzling. He hooked up his diagnostic equipment and started the systematic process of elimination that was the foundation of everything he did, the thing he'd been developing since he was 20 years old in a backyard garage. He was deep in the fuel system data when Marcus arrived at 7, let himself in, and stopped in the bay doorway. "You've been here a while," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Interesting fault pattern," Grayson said without looking up. "Look at this." He turned the laptop screen toward Marcus. "Fuel pressure is nominal at idle and under moderate load. Watch what happens at high load." Marcus came over and looked at the data, said nothing for 10 seconds. "It drops, but only briefly. Right, momentary. Not enough to set a code, just enough to cause the symptom." "Pump?" "That's the obvious answer. But look at the temperature correlation." Grayson pointed to a secondary data line. "The drop only happens when coolant temp is above a specific threshold. Pump shouldn't be temperature sensitive in that way." Marcus was quiet again, the specific quality of quiet that meant he was actually working through it. "Fuel temp? Hot soak?" "Getting warmer. Return line restriction. If the fuel's getting hot enough." "There you go," Grayson said. "Restriction in the return circuit causing fuel to heat beyond what the injectors want to see under high load conditions. Classic presentation, but the intermittent nature makes it easy to chase the wrong direction." Marcus looked at the data a moment longer. "How long did it take you to get there?" "About 40 minutes. The dealer would have replaced the pump." "The dealer would have charged 4 hours of diagnostic time and then replaced the pump," Grayson said. "And it still wouldn't have been fixed." Marcus straightened up, got his jacket off, started preparing for the day. Then, with his back to Grayson, he said, "Robert told me about the legal thing. He didn't say a lot, just that there was something going on with a big company." Grayson kept his eyes on the screen. "Sasha tell him?" "I think he figured it out from context. He's not dumb." "I know he's not dumb. I hired him." Marcus turned around. "Are we going to be okay?" Grayson looked at him directly. Marcus was 20 years old, living in an apartment with his mother still, sending part of his paycheck home because that was the circumstance. He'd built something real in this shop. Skills, confidence, a genuine craft. And the question underneath his question was whether that was going to be taken away. "Yes," Grayson said. "We are going to be okay." He said it the same way he'd said it to Lily that first evening. believing and not quite believing simultaneously, but with enough conviction to make the belief the dominant thing. There's a legal process happening. It's going to take time and it's going to be uncomfortable. But the shop stays open. The work continues. That's not changing. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, nodded once. Okay. And if Robert has questions, he can ask me directly. Same for Sasha. I'll tell them. Tell them also that this doesn't affect their pay or their hours. Is that... Marcus stopped. It's true, Grayson said firmly. Keep it true by working. Sasha arrived at 7:15, Robert at 7:30. Robert came in, set his coffee on his workbench, and looked at Grayson with the steady expression of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to know when someone else was in one and had decided not to pretend otherwise. I heard something, Robert said. I know. Come talk to me at lunch. Robert nodded and went to work. That was what Grayson valued about him. He understood the difference between information and distraction, and he didn't let one become the other while there was work to do. Lunch was a 20-minute conversation in the small office at the back of the shop that Grayson had set up over the past year. A desk, a filing cabinet, a coffee maker that Marcus had sourced from somewhere and installed without asking. He told Robert and Sasha the basics. There was a legal challenge from a corporation claiming overlap with certain patent rights. He had an attorney who believed he had a strong position. The shop was not stopping or changing its operations, and the legal process would run in the background while the business ran in the foreground. Robert listened with his arms on the table, the same attentive posture he brought to a complex engine problem. How long does this take? He asked when Grayson finished. Could be a year, could be longer. And during that time? During that time, we keep doing what we do. Anything else would be letting them win without a fight. Sasha, who had been quiet through the conversation, looked up from her coffee. This corporation, they fired you before? From your last job? Yes. And now they're trying to, she paused, choosing words, to use the law to stop you from competing. That's the straightforward version of it, yes. She considered this. Sasha was not a woman who spoke quickly or carelessly. When she said something, it was because she had already completed the thought. Then we keep working, she said. That's the answer. That's the answer, Grayson agreed. They went back to work. The afternoon brought 2 new customers, a plumbing contractor with an F350 that was throwing intermittent codes, and a woman named Denise who had driven 40 miles because someone at her church had told her this was the only shop that had been able to fix her neighbor's car after 3 other places had tried and failed. Denise drove a 2013 Honda Pilot that had been making a sound she described as like something wet is rubbing on something dry, but only when it's cold outside. Grayson identified the problem in 18 minutes, explained it to Denise in plain language, gave her a quote that made her blink twice and ask him to repeat it. That's less than half what the Honda dealer told me, she said. I know. Why? Same reason as always, he said. It's just me and the work. Denise drove home and came back the next morning for the repair. And while she was waiting, she talked to Patricia Marsh, who happened to be in picking up her husband's truck. The 2 women had never met. By the time they left, they had exchanged numbers, and Patricia had apparently recommended 3 other people to the shop based on the calls that came in over the next 48 hours. This was how it worked. Not marketing, not strategy, just doing the work correctly, consistently, and letting the results speak in a city where being spoken well of traveled faster than any advertisement. 3 weeks after the lunch conversation, Eleanor called. They've escalated, she said. They're requesting formal discovery. This moves to a federal review track. Grayson was sitting in his truck in the parking lot during his lunch break. He'd been eating a sandwich and had set it down when his phone rang. What does that mean practically? It means they're serious, and they think they have leverage. It also means the timeline extends and the process becomes more formal. He could hear her flipping through something. It means we go to work. I need your complete email archive from that period, any work documents you retained, and I need to schedule time with you to build out the prior art timeline in detail. The notebook is the foundation. We build on it. Okay. Grayson. She used his first name rarely enough that when she did, it meant she was speaking outside the professional frame for a moment. This is the part where it gets harder. I want you to know that going in, the next several months are going to require sustained focus, And I need you to keep the business running because a functioning business is part of what demonstrates standing in this dispute. Can you do both? He looked at the garage through the windshield. Through the window, he could see Marcus leaning over an engine bay with the focused concentration that had become familiar and somehow steadying. Robert's legs visible beneath a vehicle on the lift. The shop running. Yes, he said. Good. Thursday, 10 o'clock. I'll be there. He picked up his sandwich and finished it, sitting in the cold truck with the engine running for heat, watching his shop operate through the window. There was nothing clean about any of it. Nothing resolved or comfortable or moving toward an obvious endpoint. Just a man, a business, an 11-page letter from powerful people, and the stubborn daily fact of showing up. He finished the sandwich, went back inside, had a fuel system apart by 1 o'clock. The work continued. It was the only thing it could do. Eleanor's office on Thursday mornings had a particular quality to it. The kind of organized disorder that suggested a mind working faster than its physical environment could keep up with. New stacks had appeared on the credenza since Grayson's last visit. A second whiteboard had been brought in and positioned against the wall beside the first, both covered in a dense network of dates, case citations, and connecting arrows that Grayson could read the structure of even if he couldn't parse every reference. She was on the phone when he arrived and waved him into the chair across from her desk without breaking her conversation, which appeared to be with someone at a federal court clerk's office regarding filing deadlines. Grayson sat and looked at the whiteboards while he waited. He found the visual logic of them steadying. The same way a wiring diagram was steadying, the way any system made visible became less threatening than one you were only partially seeing. Eleanor hung up and immediately opened a folder without preamble. Meridian filed their formal claim package yesterday. I've been through it. She slid a tabbed copy across the desk. The short version, they're asserting that your sequential isolation methodology, specifically the thermal correlation component, was developed during your employment and constitutes work for hire under the terms of your 2016 contract. Grayson had already opened to the first tabbed section. They're ignoring the 2014 notebook. They're not ignoring it, they're contesting its relevance. Their position is that what you had in 2014 was a conceptual precursor. Their language is preliminary ideation, and that the methodology as it currently functions was substantially developed within the scope of your Meridian employment. They're drawing a line between having an idea and having a working system. That line is wrong. I know that. You know that. We have to prove it to a federal review board that doesn't know either of us. She pulled a second document from the folder, which is why we're spending today building the development timeline in detail, not the version in your head. The documented version. Every piece of paper, every email, every prototype note that shows the progression from the 2014 concepts to the functional system. We need to establish that the core architecture was yours before Meridian, and that what happened during your employment was refinement, not creation. How long does that take to build? That depends on what you have, which is what we're about to find out. She uncapped a pen. Start from the beginning. Not when you joined Meridian, the actual beginning. He started in 2013. His uncle's garage in Dearborn, a man named Frank Hale, who had been fixing cars in his driveway and a backyard workshop since the 1970s, and who had given Grayson his first real mechanical education, not through formal instruction, but through proximity. Frank narrated his thinking aloud while he worked, a habit that turned out to be the most valuable teaching method Grayson had ever encountered. Not what to do, but how to think about what to do. The structure of diagnosis before the diagnosis itself. I started keeping notes, Grayson told Eleanor, because his way of thinking through a problem was systematic in a way I wanted to remember. He'd eliminate possibilities in a specific order. Not random, not by intuition, but by the probability of failure given the symptom presentation. He taught himself statistics without knowing that's what he was doing, Eleanor wrote. And you formalized this. Slowly, over a couple of years. The thermal correlation piece came out of a specific problem, a diesel engine that was behaving differently at operating temperature versus cold start, and the fault only expressed in a narrow temperature band that normal diagnostic routines weren't designed to isolate. I spent 3 weeks working that problem in Frank's garage in the evenings after my regular job. The notes from that period are in the 2014 notebook. Which pages? He reached across the desk and took the notebook, which Eleanor had already bookmarked with colored tabs. He opened to a section near the middle, pages covered in his handwriting, the lettering slightly cramped the way it always was when he was writing quickly, following a thought. Diagrams in the margins, circled numbers connected by arrows. A sketch of a fault isolation tree that was, Grayson recognized with a small jolt, essentially identical to the core logic diagram in Meridian's patent filing. Identical, not similar. Identical. That's it, he said quietly. He turned the notebook to face Eleanor and pointed to the diagram. That's what they filed. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she reached into a different folder and withdrew a page, a reproduction of a figure from Meridian's patent documentation, and placed it beside the notebook page. The comparison was unmistakable. I need you to understand what this means procedurally, Eleanor said, and her voice had shifted into the careful register she used when what she was saying mattered enough to require precision. This is strong. This is genuinely strong. The date on this page, the consistency of the handwriting, the developmental context surrounding it. If we can establish the authenticity of this notebook with appropriate expert testimony, we have a compelling prior art argument. But Meridian will challenge the notebook's authenticity. They'll argue it could have been created after the fact. We'll need forensic document analysis, paper dating, ink dating, the works. That's expensive and takes time. How expensive? She gave him a number. He absorbed it without visible reaction, though internally he was doing the same rapid calculation he always did. What it cost against what was at stake, measured against what he could currently sustain. Do it, he said. Grayson, Eleanor, that notebook proves everything. Whatever it costs to prove the notebook is real, it's worth it. He looked at her directly. Do it. She nodded, made a note. I'll contact a forensic document examiner I've worked with before. She's thorough and she's credible as an expert witness. She paused. I also want to subpoena Meridian's internal development records from the period of your employment. If there's documentation showing that the methodology existed in its current form before you were significantly involved, that weakens their work-for-hire argument. They'll push back on the subpoena. Of course they will. That's fine. Pushing back takes time and resources, even for a large corporation, and it also signals to the board that they're nervous about what the records contain. She allowed herself a brief, thin smile. Discovery is a two-way street. He left Eleanor's office 2 hours later with a list of tasks. Locating additional email archives, reaching out to Frank for any records or recollections from the 2013 to 2014 period, identifying any former Meridian colleagues who might be willing to speak to the development timeline. The list was concrete and actionable, and having it helped, because actionable problems were the kind Grayson was constitutionally equipped to deal with. The kind he was less equipped for was what happened 4 days later. He was in the shop on a Saturday. They'd started doing limited Saturday hours to handle overflow from a week that was consistently running at capacity, when a car pulled into the parking lot that he didn't recognize. A black Mercedes S-Class, current model year, which was not the typical vehicle profile of his clientele. He was underneath a truck at the time and registered the car through peripheral awareness without giving it particular attention, until Marcus appeared at the side of the lift. There's someone asking for you, Marcus said, and his voice had a quality to it that made Grayson roll out from under the truck. Standing in the bay entrance, wearing a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Grayson's monthly operating expenses, and looking at the garage with an expression that was impossible to read from a distance, was Aurora Sinclair. She was exactly as he remembered her, and also somehow different, older in the specific way that 4 years of accumulating power aged a person, which was less in the face than in the posture, in the way she occupied space. She was looking at the shop the way she looked at everything, Grayson remembered, like she was taking its inventory. He stood up, set his wrench on the toolbox, didn't wipe his hands. Miss Sinclair, he said. His voice came out flat and even, which was what he wanted. Mr. Hale. She stepped into the bay, looked around, at the equipment, at the vehicles in progress, at Marcus, who was making no particular effort to pretend he wasn't watching. Could we speak privately? Anything you want to say to me, you can say to my attorney. I know, I came here anyway. She met his eyes. 5 minutes, not as a legal matter, as a person. He considered her for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Give us the office. Marcus went back to his work with the elaborate casualness of someone who was absolutely going to report this conversation to Robert and Sasha in detail. Grayson led Aurora to the small back office and left the door open because he wasn't having this conversation in a closed room. He sat on the edge of the desk. She stood. The office was barely large enough for both of them and smelled like motor oil and old coffee. And if Aurora Sinclair had an opinion about that, her face didn't show it. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because I wanted to see what you'd built." She said it without evasion, just a statement. "I've been hearing about this shop for over a year. I wanted to see it." "And?" "It's impressive." She said this the way she said everything, like it was data rather than a compliment. "You've built something real." "I'm aware of that." A pause. She looked at the coffee maker on the filing cabinet, Marcus's salvaged coffee maker, which was currently holding a pot of something that had been sitting since morning. "The legal action isn't personal," she said. Grayson looked at her for a long moment. "You fired me." The restructuring required Aurora. He hadn't used her first name deliberately. It came out because the formal version suddenly seemed absurd. "I had 6 years at that company. I built your diagnostic division's core methodology from nothing, and one Tuesday morning, a man named Dennis slid a paper across a table and told me my position had been eliminated." He kept his voice level because losing the level meant losing the exchange, and he wasn't going to do that. "And now your company is spending what I assume is a significant amount of money trying to claim ownership of work I did before I ever walked through your door. So don't tell me it's not personal." It landed personally. She was quiet. Something moved in her expression that he couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't guilt exactly, but it was something adjacent to acknowledgement. "The patent portfolio was assembled by our legal team. I wasn't personally involved in every filing decision." "But you knew about this one, before the letter?" A beat. "Yes." "Then why are you here? What do you actually want from this conversation?" She looked at him directly. Aurora Sinclair, he had always observed, was not someone who looked away from things. It was one of the qualities that made her effective and, in his experience, difficult. "I wanted to ask you to consider a licensing arrangement. If you agreed to license the methodology from our portfolio, the legal process ends. You continue operating. We get a modest royalty on commercial applications." Grayson felt the specific kind of anger that didn't raise his voice but went very cold and very still. "You want me to pay your company to use my own ideas? I want to resolve this without—" "No." The word came out quiet and absolute. "You don't get to take something I built and then sell it back to me. That's not a resolution. That's a different version of the same thing." She held his gaze. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence in the small office had a particular density to it. Two people who had never been in the same room without a corporate structure around them, finally in a room with nothing in between. "You're going to fight this the whole way," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "You understand what that costs?" "I understand what it costs." He stood up from the desk edge. "I also understand what it costs not to." Aurora looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. A single, small movement that felt less like concession and more like genuine acknowledgement that she'd received his answer and understood it completely. She walked to the office door, stopped. "The notebook," she said without turning around. "From 2014, I've been told we know it exists." Grayson said nothing. "If what's in it is what your attorney claims, our position is complicated." She turned then. Her expression was composed, but there was something underneath it that looked, for just a moment, like the face of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and was only now starting to see its full cost. "I wanted to tell you that directly, rather than let you find it out at the review." He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't entirely trust it, but he filed it away, because information from a source like that, even partial information, was worth keeping. "Thank you for coming," he said, which was the most neutral thing he could manage. She left. He heard the Mercedes start in the parking lot. He stood in the office for a moment, then went back to the truck he'd been working on, got under it, and picked up the wrench. Marcus materialized beside the lift within 90 seconds. "That was Aurora Sinclair." "Yes." "The one who—" "Yes." What did she want? To offer a licensing deal. Marcus was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. What did you say? No. Another pause. Okay, Marcus said with a finality that meant he'd decided this was the right answer and was moving on. The truck in Bay 2 is ready. Owner's coming at 3. Good. Tell Robert the Freightliner needs to be done by end of day. He knows. He's been on it since noon. Good, Grayson said again and went back to work. He called Eleanor that evening, told her about the visit. She listened without interrupting, which with Eleanor meant she was processing rather than simply being polite. She told you the notebook complicates their position, Eleanor said when he finished. Those were her words. That's interesting. A corporate executive doesn't make that kind of admission without reason. He could hear her thinking. Either she's trying to create an opening for settlement, or, she paused, or there's internal disagreement at Meridian about whether to pursue this, and she's positioning herself. For what? I don't know yet, but it's worth noting. A brief silence. The forensic examiner confirmed she can take the case. She'll need the notebook for 2 weeks. Grayson had been carrying the notebook back and forth from his apartment to Eleanor's office in an inside jacket pocket, the same jacket pocket where he'd put the engagement letter the day he'd signed it. Handing it over to a stranger, even a credentialed expert, produced a specific reluctance he hadn't anticipated. It's the only copy, he said. I know. She works with original documents. Chain of custody is standard procedure. Everything documented, stored properly, returned in the same condition. Eleanor's voice was patient. It's safe. Okay, he said. Okay. The 2 weeks without the notebook were strange. He hadn't realized how much he'd been drawing something from carrying it. Not superstition exactly, more like the tangible fact of the thing existing and being intact. Its absence from his pocket was a small, constant awareness. Life continued around the absence, as it tended to do. Lily's water cycle project received the highest grade in her class, which she reported with careful understatement that didn't quite conceal her satisfaction. Her teacher had, apparently, acknowledged the point about water vapor versus water droplets. She said I was technically correct, Lily reported over dinner, which I knew, but it was nice that she said it. Did you feel vindicated? Lily considered this word. A little, she admitted. Is that bad? No. Being right about something and having it acknowledged feels good. That's normal. Mrs. Holloway said I should think about the science fair. What do you think about the science fair? I think I'd need a better topic than water cycle. Something with more variables. She pushed food around her plate in a contemplative way that reminded him, with the small ache it always produced, of Sarah doing the exact same thing when she was working through a problem. Maybe something with engines. Grayson looked at his daughter. You want to do an engine for the science fair? Not a whole engine. Maybe just one principle, like how pressure affects combustion. She looked up. Can you explain combustion to me? He spent 45 minutes explaining combustion principles to his 8-year-old, who asked better follow-up questions than most adults he encountered professionally, and who at the end of it had filled a page and a half of a notebook with her own observations and diagrams. You're going to be good at this, he said, watching her draw. At what? Understanding how things work. She looked up. I already understand how most things work. He laughed. A real one. Fair enough. The forensic examiner returned the notebook on a Friday afternoon, delivered by certified courier to Eleanor's office. Eleanor called Grayson immediately. The analysis is complete, Eleanor said, and her voice had something in it that she usually kept carefully out of her professional tone, something close to satisfaction. Paper composition and ink chemistry are consistent with 2013 to 2014 manufacturing standards. The aging patterns throughout the notebook are uniform, meaning the document was created progressively over time, not produced in a single sitting. The examiner's conclusion is that the notebook is authentic to the period claimed, with high confidence. Grayson sat down. He was in the back office. Through the window, he could see Robert working under a hood with the steady focus that characterized everything the man did. High confidence, he said. Her exact language in the report is consistent with claimed period of origin with no evidence of post-dating or artificial aging. Eleanor paused. In plain terms, it's real, and she can say so under oath. He exhaled, said nothing for a moment. There's more, Eleanor said. The subpoena for Meridian's internal development records was partially granted. We're getting documentation from 2016 through 2019, the period of your employment and 2 years after. I've had a paralegal doing initial review. Another pause, longer this time. Grayson, the records show that Meridian's patent application was prepared primarily from documentation you produced during your employment. The internal attribution throughout is to your work, which means that the company that's claiming ownership of this methodology used your own documented work to file the patent and then fired you. The words landed in a specific way. Not surprising. He had suspected this, had known it in the way you sometimes know things before the evidence arrives. But suspected and confirmed were different, and the confirmation carried its own weight. Can we use this? He asked. We can use all of it. The notebook establishes prior art. The internal records establish that the methodology was attributed to you within Meridian before the filing. Together, they create a timeline that is very difficult for their attorneys to reframe. She let that settle for a moment. I want to schedule a call with their counsel next week. I believe we can change the nature of this conversation significantly. What do you mean? I mean that right now they think they're in a position of leverage. After this call, they'll know they're not. Her voice was precise, without triumphalism. Just a woman who had seen what the facts were and was telling him accurately. This shifts from Meridian threatening a small business to a small business with documented grounds to challenge the validity of a major corporation's patent filing. Grayson let that sit in the room for a moment. Schedule the call, he said. He drove home that evening through a Detroit that was moving into early spring, the gray releasing incrementally, the first suggestion of green appearing along the margins of things. He picked up Lily from his mother's house, where Carol fed them both dinner without being asked, and told Grayson he looked tired, which he was, and told Lily her drawing on the refrigerator was crooked, which it wasn't, and which was Carol's way of having an excuse to stand at the refrigerator straightening it. Driving home, Lily in the back seat, he thought about the phone call from Eleanor, about the forensic report, about what it meant that the thing he'd feared most, that the documentation wouldn't hold, that the notebook wouldn't be enough, that being right would turn out to be insufficient, had turned out to be something other than what he'd feared, not a resolution. The review board was still ahead, still months away, still uncertain in the specific way that formal legal processes were always uncertain because they involved human beings making judgments rather than engines following physical laws. But the ground had shifted again. From difficult to something he couldn't quite name yet, but that felt, for the first time since the phone call from Richard Farrow's office, like a realistic thing. "Daddy," Lily said from the back seat. "Yeah. Are you still worried about the business stuff?" He glanced in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window with the expression she sometimes got, watchful, absorbing things at a rate he couldn't always track. "A little," he said, because lying to her had never seemed like a service. "Is it getting better or worse?" "Better, slowly." "Slowly is okay," she said, with the pragmatic certainty of someone who had watched her father build something from nothing and understood at some cellular level that slow and real beat fast and hollow every time. He looked at her in the mirror again. "Where'd you get that?" She shrugged. "From watching you." He drove the rest of the way home without talking, which Lily permitted because she could read when silence was what was needed and when it wasn't. The apartment was cold when they got in. The heat had been doing something intermittent that he hadn't had time to address. And he turned it up and made hot chocolate while Lily changed into pajamas and brought her combustion notebook to the kitchen table to continue her science fair planning. He sat across from her with his own coffee while she drew, and the kitchen was warm enough now, and outside the window Detroit moved through its Friday evening, and none of the hard things had disappeared. The review board was still ahead, the legal costs were still a weight, the business still required everything he had, and the shoulder still ached. But the kitchen was warm and his daughter was drawing engine diagrams at the kitchen table, and the ground under him had shifted from nearly impossible to merely difficult, and difficult, as he'd told himself many times, was something he knew exactly how to navigate. He opened his laptop and drafted a detailed email to Eleanor about the internal Meridian documentation, questions about specific documents, notes about dates that aligned with things he remembered from his employment, details that he thought might matter and that Eleanor would assess and either use or set aside. He wrote for an hour while Lily worked beside him, the two of them quiet in the parallel way of people who were comfortable enough with each other to be silent in the same room. At 9, he closed the laptop, checked her work. The combustion diagrams were good, better than good, and had a clarity of logic that he recognized as something she'd gotten not from him explaining it, but from thinking it through herself. "This is solid," he said. "I know," she said. "But the heat transfer part isn't right yet. I need to understand it better. We'll work on it this weekend." "Okay." She closed her notebook, looked at him across the table with those amber eyes that were her mother's. "The business is going to be okay," she said. Not a question, not reassurance seeking, just a statement, offered the way she offered most of her observations, as fact. He looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table a while longer, not working, just sitting, which he almost never permitted himself. The apartment was quiet. The heat ran steadily now. On the kitchen windowsill was a small plant that Lily had grown from seed for a previous school project and that had somehow survived a year of intermittent watering and the particular challenges of a household run by a man who was usually thinking about something else. It was not a perfect plant. It leaned slightly toward the window, reaching for the light in the specific, uncomplicated way that living things did. It had one yellow leaf and several healthy ones, and had never been exactly what the seed packet's picture had promised. But it was alive, and it was still growing, and right now that was exactly enough. Eleanor's call to Meridian's council happened on a Wednesday morning, and Grayson was not on it. Eleanor had been clear about that. His presence would be counterproductive, would make it personal in ways that legal negotiations couldn't afford to be. He understood the logic. He didn't love it. He found out what happened at noon when Eleanor called him from her car. "They know," she said. "I walked Richard Farrow through the forensic report and the internal documentation summary. I gave him 20 minutes and I didn't editorialize, just the facts in sequence." How did he respond? He asked for time to consult with his client, which means he got off the phone and called Aurora Sinclair and told her they have a problem. She paused. He was careful, but I've been doing this long enough to hear when the other side is recalculating. He was recalculating. What does that mean for the timeline? It means they may come back with a settlement proposal, or they may decide to push forward anyway and take their chances at the review board, because that's what large corporations sometimes do. They calculate that the cost of fighting is worth it to maintain the principle of the patent portfolio, even if this specific filing is vulnerable. Her voice was measured, giving him the full picture without steering him toward a particular emotional response. "I don't know which way they'll go yet, but the conversation changed today. They know what they're dealing with." Grayson was in the parking lot of the shop. Through the bay door, he could see Marcus running a diagnostic on a fleet van that Carlton's company had dropped off that morning. If they push forward anyway, then we go to the review board and we make our case. And we have a strong one. A brief pause. But I want you prepared for both possibilities. A settlement offer from them at this stage would look like a number, money, or a formal acknowledgement, or some combination. It may or may not include what you actually need, which is clarity on your right to operate. "I need the right to operate," he said. "That's not negotiable." "I know. I'll make sure any proposal they bring reflects that." She paused again. "How are you holding up?" The question surprised him slightly, coming from Eleanor, who usually kept a professional distance from that particular territory. "I'm okay," he said. Then, because she'd asked directly and she'd earned a real answer, "I'm tired, but I'm okay." "This part is the hardest part," she said. "The waiting after you've done everything you can do. Most people find the action easier than the waiting." "Yeah," he said, "that tracks." He went back inside and worked the rest of the afternoon with the focused attention he'd learned to maintain regardless of what was running in the background of his head. It was a skill, that compartmentalization, not suppression, more like the ability to place a problem in a defined space and close the door on it temporarily while other things got dealt with. He'd developed it out of necessity, because a man who was thinking about his legal case while diagnosing an engine was going to miss things. And missing things cost his customers money, and his shop its reputation. The fleet van took 4 hours. The problem turned out to be an obscure fault in the transmission control module that had been intermittently corrupting shift data. The kind of thing that generated a symptom pattern dramatic enough to worry the driver, but subtle enough to evade standard diagnostic approaches. Marcus found the first thread of it, and Grayson followed it to the conclusion. And when they finished, they stood back and looked at the van with the shared satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. "How'd you know to look at the TCM?" Marcus asked. The shift hesitation was consistent, but the transmission fluid was clean. If it's a fluid issue or a mechanical wear issue, you'd see contamination. Clean fluid and a consistent hesitation means electrical or control. TCM is the logical next step. That's the kind of thing that's not in any manual. It's pattern recognition. You build it over time. Grayson picked up a rag. "You're building it. You're further along than you think." Marcus considered this. He'd grown in the past year and a half in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Not just mechanically, but in his demeanor, the way he carried himself in the shop, the way he spoke to customers. There was a confidence that had replaced the cautious competence he'd arrived with, and it was the genuine kind, earned rather than performed. "My mom came by last week," Marcus said, without particular setup. "She did?" "She drove by the shop. Didn't come in, but she drove by." He was quiet for a moment. "She called me that night and said it looked like a real business." "It is a real business." "I know, but she believes it now." He set down the wrench he'd been holding. "She asked if I thought it would last." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that if it didn't, I'd still be a better mechanic than I would have been anywhere else. And that seemed to reassure her, which is kind of a weird thing to be reassured by, but that's my mom." Grayson looked at him. "For what it's worth, it's going to last." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." Marcus picked up the wrench again. "The legal thing is moving in the right direction." "You sure?" "I'm sure enough." He didn't elaborate. Marcus nodded and accepted it, the way he'd learned to accept Grayson's measured assessments. Not blind trust, but recognition that when Grayson said something, he'd already thought it through. Meridian's response came 10 days later. Not a settlement offer, a notification that they intended to proceed to the Federal Review Board with a hearing date proposed for 8 weeks out. Eleanor called him the evening the notification arrived, and he could hear in her voice the particular quality of someone who had prepared for both possibilities and was now activating the preparation she'd hoped wouldn't be needed. "They're betting on resources," she said. "They believe that even with our documentation, they can present a more persuasive case to the board simply by bringing more weight to the table." "Can they?" "They can try. Review boards are composed of human beings, and large corporations do have an advantage in how they present complex IP arguments. The expert witnesses, the polished documentation, the sheer volume of material." She didn't soften it. "But the facts are what they are, and the facts are on our side." "Who sits on this board?" 3 members, a retired federal judge who specializes in IP matters, a technical expert with engineering credentials, and a senior patent examiner from the USPTO. The technical expert is the most important for our purposes. If we can establish the prior art clearly enough for someone with engineering background to follow, the other 2 will follow from that. "What do we need to prepare?" "Everything." She said it without drama. "Grayson, I want to be clear about what the next 8 weeks look like. This is going to be intensive. I'll need significant time from you. Testimony preparation, document review, probably a full day working through your technical explanation of the methodology so we can make it accessible to the board without losing the precision. This is on top of running your business." He thought about the next 8 weeks. The shop at capacity. Lily's science fair in 6 weeks. His mother's birthday somewhere in there. The shoulder that still ached. "I know," he said. "Tell me where to start." "Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Bring everything." He brought everything. The Monday session with Eleanor ran 4 hours and covered the technical architecture of the methodology in more detail than he'd ever articulated to anyone. Not just what it was, but the logical progression that had led him to develop it, the specific problems it was designed to solve, the ways in which it differed from standard diagnostic approaches, and why those differences mattered. Eleanor asked questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes unexpectedly precise, and she pushed back when his explanations assumed knowledge the board might not have. "Explain the thermal correlation piece as if the retired judge is the primary audience," she said at one point. Grayson stopped, reconfigured. "When an engine operates, temperature affects the behavior of every component, Fluids, metals, electrical resistances, all of it. Standard diagnostic protocols test at a fixed reference point, usually warm operating temperature. What my approach adds is a systematic correlation between symptom expression and temperature state. So instead of testing at one temperature and drawing conclusions, you're mapping how the symptom behaves across a temperature range. That gives you a different kind of information, not just what's wrong, but when it's wrong and under what thermal conditions. Eleanor wrote, and why does that matter practically? Because a significant percentage of real-world faults are temperature-dependent. They behave differently when the engine is cold versus warm versus hot-soaked. If you only test at one temperature, you can miss the fault entirely, or you can misidentify it because you're seeing the wrong version of the symptom. And the methodology you develop specifically addresses this. It's built around it. The temperature correlation is the core innovation. Everything else is built on that foundation. And this foundation is documented in the 2014 notebook. In detail, the specific pages with dates and the isolation tree diagram. Eleanor set down her pen. Good. That's what I need you to be able to say clearly, concisely, and without technical jargon in front of 3 people who will determine whether you keep your business. She looked at him over her reading glasses. We'll practice it until it's second nature. They practiced it. Over the following weeks, in sessions that ran alongside everything else, the shop, Lily's combustion project, the persistent shoulder, the accumulating tiredness, Grayson developed the ability to explain the methodology in multiple registers. Technically precise for the engineering expert, conceptually clear for the judge, practically grounded for the patent examiner. Eleanor drilled him on cross-examination scenarios, on the specific challenges Meridian's attorneys were likely to raise, on how to answer questions he didn't know the answer to without losing ground. What do you say if they ask whether your methodology would have reached its current form without your time at Meridian? She asked one afternoon, playing opposing counsel. I say that my time at Meridian gave me access to broader datasets and more complex real-world applications, which allowed me to validate and refine the methodology. But validation and refinement are not creation. The architecture was established before I joined them, and it's the architecture that's at issue. They'll push back. They'll say the current form is substantively different from the 2014 version. Then I show them the notebook. The current form is not substantively different from the 2014 version. The core logic is identical. What changed is the scale of application, not the underlying concept. Eleanor nodded. Good. Don't get defensive when they push. Stay on the facts. I know. You know it intellectually. I need you to be able to do it in the room when a well-paid attorney is directly challenging your credibility. She looked at him steadily. It's different. I understand. Do you? She set down her pen again. Grayson, the other side is going to imply, carefully, within legal limits, that you're a mechanic from a small garage who is claiming intellectual credit for work that a major corporation has documented and developed. They're going to use your background as a narrative against you. Not overtly, but the subtext will be there. I need you to be able to sit in that room and not react to the subtext. He met her eyes. I've been underestimated before. I know. And your instinct when that happens? He was quiet for a moment. To prove it. Through the work. In the hearing room, the work is the testimony. So we make the testimony precise, clear, and unassailable. That's how you prove it. She picked up her pen. Again, walk me through the thermal correlation from the beginning. He walked through it again. The week before the hearing, Frank called. Grayson's uncle was 67 now and had retired from active wrenching 2 years ago on account of a back that had finally registered its objections to 4 decades of physical work. He lived in the same house in Dearborn where the backyard garage still stood, though he used it now mainly for storage. Eleanor had contacted him months ago as part of the prior art documentation. Frank had provided a written statement attesting to his memory of the methodology discussions from 2013 and 2014, which had been submitted as supporting evidence. I've been thinking about you, Frank said when Grayson picked up. How close is it? 6 days? You ready? Grayson was sitting in his truck in the shop parking lot, having just finished a 12-hour day. It was 8 in the evening, and the sky had the specific quality of a Michigan spring night, cold still, but with something in the air that wasn't winter anymore. I think so. Eleanor says we're ready. What do you say? I say I'm as ready as I can be. Frank made a sound that Grayson had grown up interpreting. Agreement with a reservation. What's eating at you? I know we have the evidence. I know the facts support us. He stopped, tried to locate the thing precisely. I've never trusted a process this much before. I've always been able to control the outcome by doing the work well enough. This is different. Other people make the decision. That's always been true, Frank said. You just usually don't see the other people. What do you mean? You fix a man's truck, you do the work right. Then he decides whether to come back, whether to recommend you, whether your reputation holds. You don't control that. You only control the work. This is the same. Grayson considered this. The stakes are higher. Stakes always feel higher when you can see them clearly. A pause. You remember the Corvette? Summer of 2014. The one the guy was sure needed a full engine rebuild. Intermittent misfire. You spent a week on that car. You were certain it was a specific vacuum leak, but you couldn't locate it. You stripped half that engine looking for it. Found it on the 7th day, tucked behind the intake where nobody would look without a reason to look there. Frank's voice had the particular quality of someone telling a story they know the point of already. You didn't quit. You trusted what you knew, that the evidence pointed to a vacuum leak, even when you couldn't see it yet. You kept working until the facts became visible. This is different. Not really. You've done the work. The facts are there. Now you trust what you know, and you let the process do what processes do. A brief silence. You're not going to lose this thing, Gray. He wasn't certain Frank was right, but the certainty in his uncle's voice was something he could hold on to, and he held on to it. The morning of the hearing arrived with the particular unremarkable quality of days that turn out to matter more than they looked like they would from the outside. Gray sky, 52 degrees, a light wind off the river. Grayson wore the good jacket, not the work jacket, the other one, the one he wore to things that required him to be a version of himself that wasn't covered in grease. He'd ironed a shirt, which Lily had watched with great interest. You look different, she said. Different how? She studied him with her head slightly tilted. Formal, but also nervous. I'm not nervous. She gave him the look she used for statements she found insufficiently accurate. A little nervous, she allowed. A little, he admitted. She'd already eaten breakfast and was ready for school, backpack on, which was unusual enough that it registered. I made you something, she said, and held out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a drawing, her style, which had become more precise over the past year, the lines more intentional. It showed a man at a workbench, and above the workbench, in careful lettering, he knows what he's doing. Below the drawing, in smaller letters, we already know you win. This is just the part where they find out. Grayson stood in the kitchen holding this piece of paper for a moment. He was 34 years old, a man who had rebuilt a decaying garage into something real, who was about to walk into a federal hearing room to argue that what he'd created was his, and his 8-year-old daughter had drawn him a picture that said everything Eleanor's careful preparation and Frank's steady voice had been working toward. Thank you, he said. Put it in your pocket, Lily said. The good one. He put it in his inside jacket pocket. Same pocket where the engagement letter had lived, the same pocket where the notebook had ridden for months. The paper was small and warm against his chest. His mother drove Lily to school that morning. Carol had offered without being asked, in the way she handled the important things, by simply appearing and doing the necessary thing before he had to figure out how to ask. She had also, before leaving, straightened his collar without comment and told him to stand up straight. I always stand up straight, he said. You slouch when you're stressed. Stand up straight. He stood up straight. Eleanor was waiting on the steps of the federal building when Grayson arrived. She was carrying 2 large accordion files and a coffee she was already halfway through, and she looked exactly the same as she always did. Silver hair, reading glasses on her forehead, the focused composure of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had decided long ago that the preparation happened beforehand and the room itself was just the room. Ready? She said. Yeah. The board convenes at 9. Meridian's team is already inside. I saw Farrow going in. They have 4 attorneys with them and at least 2 expert witnesses from what I counted. She said this without alarm. "We have the facts." "You keep saying that." "Because it's the most important thing." She looked at him directly. "Don't try to beat them on volume. Don't try to match their resources. Just tell the truth clearly and let the documentation say the rest. That's the whole strategy." They went inside. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected. A rectangular space with a long table for the board members at the front, 2 tables facing it for the opposing parties, and a row of chairs along the wall for observers. The room had the particular smell of a government building, something institutional and slightly stale, and the fluorescent lighting was the kind that flattened everything into slightly less than full color. Meridian's team was already arranged at their table, 4 attorneys in dark suits, 2 additional figures who were presumably the expert witnesses, a paralegal arranging binders with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly. Richard Farrow sat at the center of the arrangement. He was in his mid-50s, silver-templed, with the particular composure of a man who had sat at tables like this many times and had won more often than he'd lost. He glanced at Grayson when they entered, a brief assessing look, then back to his papers. The 3 board members entered at precisely 9. The retired judge, a woman named Hargrove, small and precise, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making consequential decisions and had developed the capacity to do so without showing the weight of it. The technical expert, a man named Dr. Ellison, 50s, with the slightly distracted manner of someone whose mind was always partly somewhere else. The patent examiner, a younger man named Park, who carried a substantial binder and had the focused demeanor of someone who took the procedural dimension of these things seriously. Judge Hargrove opened without ceremony. "We're here for the matter of Meridian Automotive Corporation's patent enforcement claim against Hale Automotive regarding the diagnostic methodology described in Patent 11247839-B. This is a review proceeding, not a trial. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their positions. Evidence will be submitted for the record, and the board will deliberate. Counsel for Meridian, you may begin." Farrow stood. He was good. Grayson recognized that immediately and without resentment, the same way he recognized when another mechanic was genuinely skilled. The presentation was organized, technically articulate, and constructed to make Meridian's position sound like the reasonable and obvious one. The methodology in question had been developed within Meridian's infrastructure, with Meridian's resources, by personnel operating within the scope of their employment. The patent filing was legitimate. The prior art claim was based on preliminary notes that did not constitute a working methodology. The expert witnesses supported this. Both of them were credentialed, both were articulate, and both were clearly prepared. The first focused on the technical argument that the 2014 notebook contained conceptual precursors, not a functional system. The second focused on patent law, that work-for-hire provisions in employment contracts were broad and well-established. Grayson sat through it. He didn't react to the framing, didn't move when the expert characterized the notebook as preliminary ideation, didn't shift when Farrow's careful language implied, without stating, that a garage mechanic making a prior art claim against a sophisticated corporate patent portfolio was an inherently implausible proposition. He sat still and let it pass over him like weather. Then Eleanor stood up. She did not match their volume. She did not try to outpolish Farrow's presentation or outcredential their witnesses. She simply walked the board through the facts in the order they had occurred, with the documentation in sequence. The notebook first, the forensic analysis, paper dating, ink chemistry, uniform aging throughout, the examiner's conclusions stated plainly and in full. Then the specific pages, projected for the board, the dated entries from 2013, the fault isolation tree from 2014. Dr. Ellison leaned forward slightly when the isolation tree appeared. Grayson noticed that. Then the email records. Grayson's own emails from the pre-Meridian period, timestamps intact, describing the thermal correlation concept in language that mapped precisely to the methodology now at issue. Then Frank's written statement, read into the record, a 67-year-old retired mechanic's account of discussions in a backyard garage in Dearborn, Michigan, in 2013 and 2014 that described the core architecture of what Meridian now claimed to own. Then, the internal Meridian documentation. Eleanor handled this carefully, without theatrics. She simply showed the board what the subpoenaed records contained, attribution throughout to Grayson's work, references to his methodology as the foundational framework, the timeline of the patent filing process beginning after his termination. The methodology at issue, Eleanor said, addressing the board directly, was documented by Mr. Hale before his employment at Meridian Automotive. It was identified internally as his work throughout his tenure. It was filed as a corporate patent after his termination. The question before this board is not whether large corporations have the right to protect legitimate intellectual property. They do. The question is whether this specific filing represents legitimate corporate intellectual property, or whether it represents a corporation claiming ownership of an independent inventor's prior work. She sat down. Farrow requested rebuttal time. Got it. Made his points again, with slightly more urgency and slightly less composure. The notebook was pre-functional. The employment contract was clear. The expert testimony established development within Meridian's environment. Then Judge Hargrove looked at Grayson. Mr. Hale, you may address the board directly. He stood. Eleanor had prepared him for this. The version of it she'd prepared him for was calm and organized and walked the board through exactly what they needed to hear. That version was available to him. He had it ready. What actually came out was slightly different. I started keeping notes in 2013, he said, not because I thought they'd end up in a federal hearing room. I kept them because I was trying to solve a problem, and writing things down helped me think. I was working in my uncle's garage in Dearborn. I didn't have corporate resources. I didn't have a team or a budget or a patent attorney. I had a diesel engine with a fault I couldn't locate through standard approaches, and I had enough stubbornness to keep working it until I understood it. He paused. The thermal correlation approach came out of that problem. The logic is in the notebook, the same logic that's in Meridian's patent filing. Not similar logic, the same logic, because it's the same idea. It was my idea before I joined them, and the documentation shows that. He looked at Dr. Ellison specifically. I understand that large organizations develop things. I understand that employment contracts are broad, but I also understand fault isolation, which is literally what this methodology is about. And when you isolate the fault here, when you strip away everything else and look at the core question, where did this idea come from, and when? The answer is in the notebook. It's on those pages with those dates in my handwriting. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Judge Hargrove made a note. Dr. Ellison was looking at the projected notebook page still visible on the screen. Park was writing something in his binder. The board took a recess to deliberate. Grayson and Eleanor sat at their table. She had a legal pad in front of her and wasn't writing on it. He had a cup of water that he wasn't drinking. Meridian's team murmured among themselves at their table with the controlled energy of people accustomed to waiting. You went off script toward the end, Eleanor said quietly. I know. It was fine, she said. Dr. Ellison's response to the notebook page was what I was hoping for. Did you see him lean forward? Yes. He understood exactly what he was looking at. They waited. The recess ran 40 minutes, which Eleanor said was not unusual and not an indicator either way, though the way she said it suggested she was watching the time too. When the board returned, Judge Hargrove arranged her papers with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had delivered verdicts before and understood that the manner of delivery was itself a form of respect for the process. The board has reviewed the submitted documentation and heard from both parties, she said. Our determination is as follows. Grayson put his hand in his jacket pocket, felt the folded paper there. Lily's drawing, warm from his body heat. The prior art evidence submitted by the respondent, specifically the forensic authenticated documentation from 2013 and 2014, supported by corroborating email records and third-party testimony, establishes a credible and documented claim of independent development predating the patent filing in question. The board finds that the petitioner has not demonstrated sufficient grounds to establish that the methodology as claimed was developed solely within the scope of the respondent's employment. Accordingly, the petition for patent enforcement against Hale Automotive is denied. The respondent retains full right to operate using the methodology in question. Grayson sat very still for a moment. Eleanor set down her pen. Across the table, Richard Farrow was already closing his binders with the measured efficiency of a man who had lost before and knew how to do it without visible collapse. Judge Hargrove finished the formal language. the record, the documentation, the next steps. And then the room began to move. People stood. Papers were gathered. Eleanor turned to Grayson. "We won," she said. It was the first time he'd heard anything like relief in her voice. He stood up. His legs were steadier than he'd expected. He shook Eleanor's hand, which felt inadequate for everything she had done, and she seemed to understand that because she held the handshake for a moment longer than usual. He walked out of the hearing room and into the corridor and stood there for a moment with the noise of the building around him, footsteps, voices, the mechanical hum of a large institutional space doing what it did, and reached into his jacket pocket, unfolded the paper. He knows what he's doing. We already know you win. This is just the part where they find out. He stood in the corridor of a federal building in Detroit with his daughter's drawing in his hands, and he thought about the $2,000 garage with the leaking roof, about Dennis and his soft hands and the pink slip on a Tuesday, about 2 years of 7-day weeks and cold coffee and a compressor that used to work 60% of the time, about Marcus learning to read fault data, about Robert's steady hands on a Freightliner, about Sasha and her electrical precision, about Frank's backyard garage and the diesel engine that wouldn't give up its fault, and the 7 days it took to find it. He thought about Lily eating cereal for dinner and saying you should fix cars. You're really good at fixing cars, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had already assessed the situation and arrived at the obvious conclusion. He folded the paper carefully and put it back in his pocket. Then he took out his phone and called his daughter's school, asked to leave a message for Lily Hale in Mrs. Holloway's class. The receptionist said she'd pass it along. "Tell her," Grayson said, "that they found out." The message reached Lily during afternoon recess, which meant that by the time Carol picked her up at 3 o'clock, she already knew. Carol called Grayson from the school parking lot, and he could hear Lily in the background explaining the situation to his mother with the precise vocabulary of someone who had been following the legal proceedings more closely than any 8-year-old probably should have. "She says you won," Carol told him. "We won." A pause. His mother was not a woman who cried easily or often, and what came through the phone was not crying exactly, more like the sound of someone releasing a breath they had been holding for a very long time. "Come for dinner," she said. "Mom." "Grayson, come for dinner." He came for dinner. Carol made pot roast, the same thing she'd made the day he'd driven to her house from the Meridian parking lot with $63 in his bank account and a termination letter he hadn't taken. He didn't know if she'd chosen it deliberately or if it was coincidence, and he didn't ask, because either way the pot roast was there, and the kitchen smelled the way her kitchen had always smelled, and Lily sat at the table doing homework while Carol moved around the stove the way she'd done for 40 years. And the specific quality of that evening, the ordinary domesticity of it, the absence of crisis, was something Grayson felt in his chest, the way you feel things you hadn't realized you'd been missing until they return. "Tell me exactly what happened," Lily said, without looking up from her homework. He told her. He kept it simple. The board, the documentation, Eleanor's presentation, the decision. He didn't dramatize it. Lily listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered, pencil still in hand, occasionally making a small note in the margin of whatever she was working on as if she was filing away points for later consideration. When he finished, she nodded once. "The notebook," she said. "That was the most important part. The notebook was the foundation. Everything else built on it. Because you kept records." "Because I kept records." She went back to her homework. After a moment, "I'm going to keep better records of my science fair experiments." Grayson looked at his daughter. "Good idea." Carol set a plate in front of him without comment. He ate, and the pot roast was the same as it had always been. Not elegant, not sophisticated, just food made with attention by someone who understood that feeding people was a form of care that required no other justification. Frank called during dinner. Grayson stepped into the hallway to take it. "Eleanor told me," Frank said. His voice had the particular warmth of a man who had been holding something tight and had just let it go. "I want you to know I never doubted it." "I know you didn't." "The notebook. Yeah. I remember the evening you were writing those pages," Frank said. "You were sitting at my workbench with the diesel apart in front of you, and you were writing and erasing and writing again. You'd been on that engine for 4 days. A pause. "You looked like a man who wasn't going to stop until he understood it. I remember thinking that." Grayson leaned against the hallway wall. The sounds of the kitchen came through the door. Carol and Lily talking about something. Lily's voice with the particular elevated energy she carried when she was genuinely excited about a topic. "I didn't know those notes would matter this much," he said. "The notes that matter are always the ones you kept for the wrong reason," Frank said. "You kept them because the thinking required it. That's the only reason you should ever keep notes." He went back to the kitchen, finished dinner, drove home with Lily asleep in the back seat before they'd made it 4 blocks, the way she'd been doing since she was small, dropping into sleep with the absolute efficiency of a child who trusted completely that the adult driving would handle the rest. He carried her in. She was getting heavy enough that this was becoming an annual renegotiation. At some point, she'd be too big to carry, and he was aware that each time he did it might be one of the last times, which was the kind of thought he tried not to linger on for too long because it led somewhere he wasn't ready for. He got her to bed, got her shoes off without waking her, pulled the blanket up, stood in her doorway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table with his phone and his legal files and began the process of understanding what came next. Because winning the hearing was not the end. It was a specific thing that had been resolved, the patent challenge, the immediate threat to his right to operate. But the business had continued through the entire legal period, accumulating momentum and obligation simultaneously. And now that the weight of the dispute was off, what remained was still a company with employees and clients and a physical facility that had outgrown itself and a set of decisions that needed to be made. Eleanor had told him, the week before the hearing, that regardless of the outcome, they should discuss the business's next steps. He hadn't been able to think clearly about that while the review was pending. Now he could. He opened a notebook, a different one from the 2014 notebook, a new one, bought at a drugstore and used for operational notes, and started writing. Current capacity, current revenue, current expenses. What the shop could do if it had more space. What the shop could do if it had more people. What it would cost to expand versus what it would return. The kind of calculations he'd been doing in the back of his head for months without committing them to paper, because committing them to paper felt premature while the legal dispute was unresolved. He wrote for 2 hours. When he looked up, it was past midnight. He looked at what he'd written. It wasn't a plan yet. It was the raw material of a plan. Numbers, questions, possibilities, marked with asterisks that meant he needed more information before he could assess them. But the shape of something was there. The shape of what Hale Automotive could become if the decisions that had been deferred while fighting for survival could now be made with the forward attention they deserved. He closed the notebook and went to bed. The morning after the hearing, he told his team before they started work. Not a long speech. Grayson was not a speech man, and his team knew that. He stood in the bay with the 3 of them gathered and told them the board had ruled in their favor, that the patent challenge was dismissed, that the shop would continue operating exactly as it had been. Robert nodded with the solid, unsurprised quality he brought to most things. "Good," he said. "The Kenworth in Bay 2 needs attention." Sasha looked at Grayson with the quiet directness that was her natural mode. "It was never going to go the other way," she said. "The work speaks." Marcus was the only one whose reaction showed on his face, a visible relief that he immediately tried to contain and didn't quite succeed. "So we're good," he said. "We're good. We're staying open. We're staying open." Grayson looked at him. "And Marcus, I said your pay was going up when I could make it true. I'm making it $1.50 more starting this week. It'll go up again in 6 months." Marcus processed this. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You earned it over the past year and I should have gotten to it sooner." They went to work. The Kenworth needed a complete fuel system overhaul. The week's schedule was full. A new client, a regional food distribution company with a fleet of refrigerated vans, had called 2 days earlier looking for a shop that could handle their maintenance contract, and Grayson had deferred the conversation pending the hearing. He called them back that afternoon. The contract negotiation took 3 days and resulted in a commitment that effectively filled a third of the shop's weekly capacity on its own. It was the kind of commercial relationship that changed the character of a business. Not just revenue, but stability. The kind of predictable baseline that allowed everything else to be built on top of it rather than next to it. He called Eleanor to tell her about the contract. She was characteristically measured in her response. "Congratulations. Make sure the contract terms are reviewed before you sign. I was going to ask if you did contract review. I don't, but I can recommend someone. A pause. How are you sleeping? The question caught him off guard again, the same way it had the first time she'd asked it. Better than I was. Good. Another pause. Grayson, what you did here, most people don't do it. They calculate the cost and they fold. You should know that's not nothing. You did most of the work. I did the legal work. You did everything else. That's not a small thing. She said it with the particular flatness that meant she was being straight with him, not consoling him. I hope the next phase of the business goes well. I'll let you know how it develops. Please do, she said, and try to get some sleep. The next phase developed faster than he'd expected and slower than he'd hoped, which turned out to be exactly the right pace. He found the new space 8 weeks after the hearing, a former industrial facility 4 miles from the original garage, substantially larger, with ceiling clearance that could accommodate commercial vehicles, proper electrical infrastructure, and a loading dock that would serve the refrigerated van fleet work. The lease was real money. The move was logistically complex. The renovation needed to make it functional for his purposes was something he planned and managed himself over a period of 3 months, pulling in contractors for what required licensing and doing the rest with his team during hours that came before and after the regular workday. Marcus complained about the hours, not bitterly. He wasn't built for bitterness, but directly, which Grayson respected. We're working 7 days again, Marcus said one Saturday, sitting on an overturned bucket in the new space eating a sandwich while Grayson ran conduit along a wall. For another month. Then it levels. You said that last month. Last month I was wrong about the timeline. This month I'm right. How confident are you in that? Grayson considered the conduit run he was working on. 70%. Marcus ate his sandwich. I'll take 70%. How's your mom? She drove by the new space last week. She didn't say much, but she sent me a text later that said, "Looks good," with a period at the end. For her, that's basically a standing ovation. Grayson smiled at the wall. The period means she's serious. That's what I figured. They opened the new facility on a Thursday because Grayson had a superstitious relationship with Tuesdays now that he couldn't entirely reason his way out of. Not a ceremony, not a ribbon cutting, just the bay doors open and the equipment in place and the first vehicles scheduled for service arriving at their appointed times and the work beginning the way work always began, which was one task at a time. He hired 2 additional mechanics over the following months. A woman named Teresa, who had 15 years of fleet experience and a manner so methodical she made Robert look impulsive. A young man named Deshaun, who had just aged out of a mentorship program and had the same quality Grayson had recognized in Marcus. Raw intelligence applied to mechanical problems with a focus that exceeded what his formal training would have predicted. Grayson hired him after a single working interview, the way he'd hired Marcus because credentials were useful and observation was more useful. The team was 6 people now. Not a large company, still a small business by any meaningful measure, but a different scale from the 2-bay garage on the east side. Different character too, the way any organization takes on the character of the people who work in it. Precise, direct, low on hierarchy, high on accountability. The kind of place where you could ask a stupid question without judgment as long as you were trying to understand something, and where producing bad work without acknowledging it was the only real offense. Lily turned 9 in October. Her science fair project, the combustion demonstration, with combustion principles explained through a controlled experiment that showed pressure and temperature relationships in a visual format she'd designed herself, had won first place in the regional competition 2 months earlier. She had received the award with the particular composure of someone who had expected to win because she'd done the work to deserve it, and who found excessive display about expected outcomes slightly undignified. Grayson had been in the audience and had clapped with the energy of a man trying not to make a scene while also being incapable of containing himself. "You could have been less obvious," she told him in the parking lot afterward. "You won a science fair." "I know, you still could have been less obvious." "Lily, you explained combustion principles at the 3rd grade level and built a demonstration that the judges said was more rigorous than most middle school entries." She considered this. 5th grade level, she corrected. "I pitched it at 5th grade, not 3rd. "You're right. I apologize." "It's okay." She accepted his apology with a generosity that was one of her better qualities. "The clapping was fine. He framed the award ribbon, hung it in the shop office next to the drawing she'd made for the hearing day. The wolf in front of the house was still on his toolbox, slightly curled at the edges now, but intact. It was around this time, 5 months after the hearing, that he got the call from a man named Harrison Webb, no relation to Marcus, who ran a manufacturing industry conference called the Midwest Precision Summit and had heard about Hale Automotive through the regional trucking network. Harrison wanted to know if Grayson would speak on a panel about independent innovation in the automotive service sector. The panel was 4 people, and 2 of them were executives from mid-sized corporations. Grayson's first instinct was to say no. He'd said no to 3 similar requests over the years. He was not a conference person, not a speaker, not someone who had ever thought of his work as a topic rather than simply as work. But something made him pause before declining, which was unusual for him, and he sat on the request for 2 days before calling Harrison back. "What's the panel specifically about?" he asked. "Independent operators and how they're solving problems that institutional structures can't. You're a case study, Mr. Hale, not just in what you built, but in how you defended it." The legal thing. The legal thing became known in certain circles. People talk. Harrison's voice had the genuine quality of someone who found the topic interesting rather than someone performing interest. "You're not the only person who's been in that situation, but you're one of the few who came out the other side with the business intact." Grayson thought about it for another day. Then he called Eleanor. "Should I do this?" he asked. "What do you want from it?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking." "That's not why you're asking," she said. "You're asking because you've already decided and you want someone to confirm it." She let that sit for a moment. "Do you think there are other people in your situation, small operators, independent inventors, who could use the information your experience contains?" He thought about the 11-page letter from Meridian's legal team, about Eleanor's voice explaining the mechanics of how large corporations used expensive litigation as a deterrent, about the first attorney he'd called, the one who'd told him to consider a licensing arrangement as the rational choice, about how many people in that situation had no Eleanor, no notebook, no documentation, and had folded because the math said folding was sensible. "Yes," he said, "probably a lot of people." "Then do the panel." He did the panel. Arrived at the conference in a jacket that was not the work jacket, but also was not the formal jacket he'd worn to the hearing, something in between, which felt right. Sat at a table with 2 corporate executives and a woman who ran a small precision manufacturing company in Ohio and who turned out to be the most interesting person in the room. The moderator asked questions. The executives gave answers that were thoughtful and well-constructed and essentially about the importance of institutional resources. When it was Grayson's turn to respond to a question about how independent operators protected their innovations, he gave the answer that was true and direct, and had the particular quality of a thing said by someone who had learned it through experience rather than analysis. "Document everything," he said. "Not for litigation, for your own thinking. The documentation that saved my business wasn't created to be evidence. It was created because the thinking required it. I was writing things down because I was trying to understand a problem. The fact that those notes had dates and continuity and showed the development of an idea over time, that was a byproduct of the habit, not the purpose of it." He paused. "The second thing is, know what you built. Not in a legal sense. Know what you built because you built it yourself, and you understand every piece of it." When someone challenges your ownership of an idea, the most powerful thing you can bring into that room is a clear and complete understanding of how the idea developed and why it developed the way it did. You can hire an attorney to present your case. You can't hire someone to understand your own work for you. The room was quiet for a moment after that. The Ohio manufacturing woman was writing something on a notepad. After the panel, she found him. Her name was Grace Okafor, no relation to Robert, though Grayson noted the name. She was in her mid-40s, sharp, and had the quality of someone who had absorbed his specific point about documentation and was already applying it to her own situation. "I have a patent dispute in early stages," she said, without preamble. "Different sector, same basic structure. Large company, small independent, methodology overlap." "Get Eleanor Voss," he said. "I'll give you her number." Grace looked at him. "Just like that?" "Just like that. She's good, and she works on the right side of the table." He gave her Eleanor's number. He didn't know if it would help. He hoped it would. That was all he could do with it. He drove back to Detroit that evening and arrived at the shop at 8 o'clock to find Marcus still there, finishing paperwork on a repair job. Marcus looked up when Grayson came in. "How was the conference thing?" "Interesting." Grayson set his jacket on the hook. "How was the day?" "Smooth. Teresa handled the Kenworth. Deshaun found a wiring issue on the refrigerated van that I would have missed." He said this last part with the equanimity of someone who had processed his own ego enough to report accurately. "He's good." "I know. Better than me at electrical stuff." "You're better than him at fuel systems." "Yeah." Marcus considered this. "Is that how it works? Everyone's better at something?" "If you hire right." Marcus looked at the shop around them. The equipment, the vehicles in progress, the organized space that bore no resemblance to the two-bay garage on the east side. "This is a real company now," he said. "It's been a real company." "No, I mean," he searched for the right word. "It's a different size of real." He looked at Grayson. "You've been doing this for what, 4 years?" "Just over." "From $2,000. "And a lot of hours." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had the expression he sometimes got when he was thinking something through that went deeper than the technical. "Can I say something?" "You're going to regardless." "Fair." He set down the paperwork. "When I was working at the oil change place, I didn't think this kind of thing was possible. Not for someone like me, coming from where I come from. I thought you needed to start with money or connections or—" He stopped. "But you didn't have any of that. And you built this anyway." Grayson looked at him. Marcus was 21 now, older in the ways that mattered, still young in the ways that made Grayson want to be careful about how he said things. Because words directed at young people who are paying attention have a longer half-life than most adults remember. "I had some things," Grayson said. "I had skills. I had a notebook full of good ideas. I had a daughter who needed me to not quit." He paused. "And I had people. Frank, who taught me how to think about problems. Eleanor, who believed the case was real. Robert and Sasha and you, who kept the shop running while everything else was happening." He looked at Marcus directly. "Nobody builds anything alone. What you can control is whether you do the work honestly enough and well enough that the right people want to be part of it." Marcus absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. "Do you think I could do something like this? Eventually?" "I think you're already doing something like this. You're learning a craft. You're showing up. You're getting better every month." Grayson picked up his jacket. "The rest follows if you don't quit on it." "I'm not going to quit on it." "I know," Grayson said. "That's why I hired you." He drove home. The city moved past the windows of the truck, the same city it had always been, complicated and uneven and occasionally difficult and full of people doing their best. Inside circumstances they hadn't chosen, and sometimes beside circumstances they had. He'd driven these streets for 4 years now, in the same truck with the cracked dashboard he'd still never gotten around to replacing. 249,000 miles on it now. It ran because he maintained it, which was the same thing that was true of everything else in his life that still worked. Lily was awake when he got home. She was supposed to be in bed, and she knew she was supposed to be in bed, and had clearly made a calculated decision that the calculation was worth it. She was at the kitchen table with a book open, but she hadn't been reading it because the book was upside down. "You're supposed to be asleep," he said. "I know." She turned the book right side up, as if that retroactively fixed the situation. "How was the conference?" "Good." "Did you talk?" "Yes." "Were you nervous?" "A little." He got a glass of water, sat across from her. "Why are you still up?" She looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to find the right words for. "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "About when I'm older, what I want to do." She folded her hands on the table, a gesture that was almost comically adult on a 9-year-old's body. "I think I want to build something." "Build what?" "I don't know yet. Something useful. Something that solves a problem that isn't solved yet." She paused. "Like you did." Grayson looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's precision and the particular stubbornness that came from somewhere he couldn't fully account for and was probably, if he was honest, recognizable when he looked in the mirror. She was 9 years old, and she had watched him rebuild a life from almost nothing, and she was sitting at the kitchen table past her bedtime to tell him she wanted to build something. You will, he said. You don't know that. I know you. It's the same thing. She considered this, seemed to find it acceptable. Okay. She closed the book. Will you help me when I get stuck? Yes. Even if what I'm building doesn't make sense to you yet? Especially then. She nodded, satisfied. Stood up and carried the book toward her room, then stopped in the doorway. Daddy? Yeah. I'm glad you didn't take the licensing deal. He looked at her. How do you know about the licensing deal? You and Eleanor talk on speaker sometimes when you're cooking dinner. He made a note to be more careful about that. I'm glad I didn't take it either. It would have been wrong. It was your idea. Yes. Ideas belong to the person who had them. She said it with the straightforward certainty that was one of her defining qualities. Not inflexible, not naive, just clear about the things that were clear. That's important. It is, he said. Okay. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after she'd gone, the apartment quiet around him. The plant on the windowsill had grown, taller and less lopsided than it had been, the yellow leaf long gone and replaced by two healthy ones. He'd been watering it more consistently since the hearing, not as a metaphor, just because he'd finally remembered to do it. He thought about the $2,000 garage with the leaking roof and the compressor that worked 60% of the time. He thought about Dennis and the pink slip and the parking garage where he'd sat for 40 minutes before he could drive. He thought about Aurora Sinclair in his back office, saying it wasn't personal, and the careful, absolute no that had come out of him before he'd finished thinking it. He thought about what it had actually taken. Not the dramatic version, not the version where a man rises against impossible odds through pure will and native genius. The real version, which was messier and slower and more dependent on other people than the narrative usually admitted. Frank's backyard garage. Carol's pot roast. Marcus showing up at 6:45 when he'd been told 7 o'clock. Robert's legs visible under a vehicle on the lift. Just working, just doing the work. Eleanor's reading glasses on her forehead and her willingness to be on the right side of the table. The notebook, kept for the wrong reason. That turned out to be the right reason. And Lily. Always Lily. Eating cereal for dinner and watching him think and asking precise questions and drawing wolves in front of purple houses and telling him that they already knew he'd win. This was just the part where everyone else found out. He wasn't a different man than he'd been 4 years ago. That was maybe the thing he most wanted to be true about himself, that he hadn't needed to become someone else to build what he'd built. Same hands, same stubbornness, same tendency to sit in a parking lot for 40 minutes when something hard had happened, because processing required time and there was no shortcut through it. Same understanding that the work was the answer, not always sufficient on its own, but always necessary, always the foundation. You did the work because you did the work, and the rest of it, the recognition, the vindication, the business growing into something real, came from that, or it didn't. And if it didn't, you went back and did more work, better work, more precise work, until the facts became undeniable. He pulled out the notebook he'd been writing operational notes in, looked at the pages from the night after the hearing, the numbers, the questions, the asterisked possibilities. He added a few more lines. Thoughts about a conversation he'd had with a supplier who was looking for a preferred service partner. Thoughts about a training program for young mechanics that Grace Okafor had mentioned at the conference, one she was developing in Ohio, and whether something similar made sense in Detroit. That last one he circled. Not a plan yet. A possibility. The kind of thing that started as a circled note in a practical notebook and became something real if you kept returning to it, kept working it, kept being honest about what it required and whether you were willing to provide that. He closed the notebook. He washed his glass and turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hall past Lily's room, where she was asleep with the absolute efficiency she'd always had. The blanket pulled up, the science fair ribbon visible on her desk in the ambient light from the window. The combustion notebook opened to a page she'd probably been reviewing before she came out to wait for him at the kitchen table. He stood in her doorway. Did the thing parents do. She was 9. In another 9 years she'd be in college. Or not. She'd make her own decision about that, with the same precise deliberateness she brought to everything else. And it would be the right decision because she'd have thought it through. He couldn't know what she'd decide to build. He couldn't know what problems would need solving by the time she was old enough to solve them. He couldn't protect her from the parts of building something that were genuinely hard, the setbacks, the nights of calculation at kitchen tables, the people who would underestimate her in ways that were both infuriating and ultimately irrelevant. What he could do was exactly what he'd been doing. Show her what it looked like to do the work honestly. Show her that keeping records mattered. Show her that the people around you were not incidental to what you built, but were in fact part of its foundation. Show her that losing your footing and finding it again was not failure. It was just what the process looked like from the inside. And be there when she got stuck, as promised. He went to bed. In the morning, Detroit was gray and cold and entirely itself. And Grayson Hale got up at 5:30 because the work started at 6:30, and he'd always been there an hour before anyone else. He made coffee, checked his phone, 2 messages from clients, 1 from a supplier, nothing from Eleanor, which meant the world continued on its axis without immediate legal drama, which was a condition he had come to actively appreciate. He woke Lily at 7. She was, as she was every morning, approximately 30% coherent and requiring 12 minutes before she was functional. He made her eggs, which she ate while reading her combustion notebook with the glazed focus of someone who was technically awake but had not yet fully committed to the day. He dropped her at school. She got out of the car and walked toward the entrance with the slightly lopsided backpack that she refused to let him adjust because she preferred it that way. For reasons she had explained once and that had not fully made sense to him, but that he'd accepted because she was precise about everything else and presumably had thought this through too. She turned at the door. "Have a good day," she said. "You too, Bug." She went inside. He drove to the shop, pulled into the lot of the new facility, larger than the old one, still his, still the product of $2,000 in 4 years, and the stubbornness of a man who had been told on a Tuesday morning that he was finished and had decided that Tuesday was wrong. He unlocked the bay doors. The shop was empty and quiet at this hour, the way he'd always preferred it. The time before anyone else arrived, when it was just the space and the work and the clear knowledge of what the day required. He put on his coffee, changed into his work jacket, pulled on gloves, stood for a moment in the center of the bay, the empty space around him, the equipment waiting, the day beginning. Then he got to work. That was the whole of it, really. Not the verdict, not the victory, not the conference panel or the contract with the refrigerated van fleet or the circled note about a training program that might become real or might remain a note. Those things mattered, but they weren't the center of the thing. The center was this: a man who understood engines, a problem waiting to be understood, and the sustained, imperfect, entirely human willingness to keep working it until the facts became visible. Everything else was built on that. Everything worth keeping always is.